Every morning, Naomi Holloway rolled into the most powerful office in the city, ran a billion-dollar empire from a wheelchair, and smiled at every camera like nothing was wrong. She had fired 3 neurologists, tried treatments that cost more than most people's houses, and still, every night, she went home unable to feel her own hands. The doctors called it progressive. Her board called it manageable. But one janitor, mopping floors at midnight, smelled something wrong and changed everything. If this kind of story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The elevator doors opened on the 43rd floor, and the first thing anyone ever noticed about Naomi Holloway was that she was already on her phone. The second thing they noticed, if they were paying attention, was the wheelchair. Most people looked away quickly, not out of cruelty, but out of that specific human discomfort that comes from seeing something that doesn't match the story you've already built in your head. Naomi Holloway was 31 years old. She appeared on the covers of business magazines. She was photographed at charity galas, at industry conferences, at ribbon-cutting ceremonies for new distribution hubs in Singapore and Rotterdam and Sao Paulo. In every photograph, she was standing, or rather, what felt like standing. The staging was deliberate. The photographers knew how she wanted to be framed. From the waist up, Naomi Holloway was untouchable. Below that, the reality was different, and she kept it behind closed doors with the same discipline she applied to quarterly earnings and hostile acquisition bids. Her assistant, Marcus, was already waiting when she came off the elevator, tablet in hand, reading from his morning brief before she'd even cleared the doors. The Frankfurt terminals flagged a customs delay. They need your authorization to reroute through Antwerp, which adds roughly 9 hours to the shipping window but preserves the contract penalty clauses. The Caldwell Group called again about the merger terms, and you have the board pre-meeting at 11. "Tell Frankfurt to reroute," she said. Her voice was crisp, no hesitation. "The 9 hours is cheaper than the goodwill hit if we miss delivery windows. Tell the Caldwell Group I'll call them after lunch, not before, and if they push back, tell them that's the offer." She paused outside her office door, balancing the tablet on her lap while scrolling. "And push the board pre-meeting to 11:30. I need 30 minutes this morning." 4. Physical therapy. She said it the way someone might say dentist. Matter of fact, mildly inconvenient, nothing more. Marcus wrote it down without comment. He was good at that, the not commenting part. He'd been Naomi's assistant for 2 years, and in that time he'd learned the specific geography of what she would and wouldn't discuss. The company, always. Her health, almost never. The line between them was a wall, and Marcus had the good sense to stay on the right side of it. The office itself was a room designed to project certainty. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides, the city spreading out below in the particular gray-gold light of early morning. The desk was dark walnut, enormous, scattered with the controlled chaos of someone who worked constantly and organized instinctively. On the credenza behind the desk, a row of small framed photographs. Her parents at their retirement party, her younger brother at his college graduation, a picture of her and a group of colleagues at the opening of the Jakarta hub 3 years ago, before any of this had started. In that photo, she was standing, laughing, drink in hand. She never looked at it directly. She wasn't sure why she kept it there. The physical therapist, a serious-faced woman named Dr. Vance, arrived at 8:15 with a folding table and a soft-sided equipment case. She had the professional manner of someone who had learned over many years exactly how much warmth was welcome and exactly when to stop. "How were the nights?" she asked, setting up. "Fine." "Any new tingling? Burning sensation in the feet?" "Some." Naomi said it without looking up from the document she was reviewing. "The left side, mostly. Nothing I haven't had before." Dr. Vance paused. "Naomi, I know." Dr. Reinholdt's treatment plan specifically said, "I know what it said." This time she did look up. The look wasn't unkind exactly, but it didn't invite argument either. "I'll log it. I'm logging everything." The therapy session lasted 40 minutes, most of it passive range of motion work. Dr. Vance moving Naomi's legs through positions that Naomi's own nervous system could no longer reliably execute. There was a time, about a year ago, when Naomi had still been able to walk short distances with a cane. She remembered the specific morning that had stopped, not because of one catastrophic event, but because of a gradual accumulation of bad days until one morning there simply wasn't enough strength left to rely on, and the cane became a chair. And the chair became permanent in a way that still, 16 months later, felt provisional to her. Like something she was still in the middle of, not quite done losing. After Dr. Vance left, Marcus brought coffee. Naomi drank it standing, or rather positioned, beside the window, looking down at the city below, which at this hour was still mid-process, not yet fully itself. On the corner of her desk sat the pitcher. It was ceramic, unglazed, a warm pale clay color, roughly 16 inches tall with a hand-carved geometric pattern around the base. She'd ordered it 18 months ago on the recommendation of Dr. Aldrich Reinhold, who had been treating her for 15 months and who had been, when she first met him, the most impressive physician she'd encountered across several years of searching. He had a practice in the kind of building that didn't have a sign out front. You had to know to look for it. And a clientele that didn't discuss their medical care in public. And a reputation within a particular network of very wealthy, very private patients for treating the cases that mainstream medicine had given up on. Naomi had arrived at his office skeptical and desperate in roughly equal measure. She'd been through 2 neurologists, a specialist in autonomic disorders, a trial program at a research hospital in Zurich, and more rounds of testing than she could remember clearly. Every result had come back with different language pointing at the same general shape. Something was attacking her nervous system, progressive in nature, and imperfectly understood. Reinhold had listened to her case summary for 45 minutes without interrupting, which was already more than most doctors managed. Then he'd outlined a treatment approach that was integrative, his word, combining pharmaceutical interventions with what he called environmental correction. The body, he explained, is not just a biological system, it's an environmental one. What surrounds us, what we consume, what we breathe and touch and drink, all of it either supports recovery or undermines it. The clay pitcher was part of the environmental correction. Mineral-rich water stored in unglazed traditional clay, he had told her, has measurable alkaline properties and trace mineral content that supports cellular repair and reduces inflammatory response in patients with complex neurological conditions. He'd sent her a paper, dense, citations heavy, published in a journal she'd looked up and found to be legitimate enough. He'd recommended she drink at least 2 liters per day from the pitcher, always with fresh lemon juice, never refrigerated. Something about temperature affecting the mineral transfer. She'd been doing it every day for 14 months. The pitcher sat on the corner of her desk where she'd see it. She refilled it each morning. She drank from the tall glass beside it, lemon water first, every day, the way other people took their vitamins. Cole Bennett arrived for his shift at 11 p.m. He drove a 2009 Honda Civic with a cracked left taillight that he kept meaning to fix and hadn't gotten around to. The back seat had a booster seat secured with the seatbelt, a small purple backpack folded beside it, and a library book about penguins that his daughter Iris had been carrying everywhere for 3 weeks because she was in what he'd come to think of as her penguin phase. Iris was 6. She went through phases. Before penguins, it had been volcanoes. Before that, ambulances. Cole had learned more about lava composition and paramedic equipment than he'd ever expected to know, and he had the feeling the penguins weren't going anywhere soon. He parked in the employee lot, employees with keys to the cleaning supply closet, he sometimes thought, not employees with reserved spaces, and sat in the car for a moment before going in. It was a habit, not tiredness exactly, more like a brief recalibration. A daily transition between the 2 versions of his life, the one where he was Iris's father, fully present, helping with homework and making dinners and reading about penguin migration, and the one where he was the man pushing a cleaning cart through the polished corridors of a building full of people who did not particularly see him. He'd made his peace with that, more or less. Before the layoffs, Cole had worked in industrial safety, specifically in hazardous materials assessment and remediation, a field that sounds technical and is, but that at its core comes down to paying a particular kind of attention. You learn to notice things in that work. Patterns. Discrepancies. The smell that isn't quite right in a chemical storage area. The surface discoloration that suggests leaching. The symptoms in workers that are slightly too consistent, too patterned to be coincidence. Cole had been good at it, genuinely, demonstrably good. And when his company folded in the economic downturn 3 years ago, He'd filed for a handful of positions in related fields and found that the field had, in the interim, contracted sharply. The economy had done what economies sometimes do. It had rearranged what was possible for a significant number of people without asking them about it first. So there was the cleaning job. It paid enough, combined with what he'd managed to save, to cover the apartment and daycare and groceries more or less. His neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, watched Iris on the nights when he worked, and in exchange, Cole did her grocery shopping and fixed things around her apartment. And it was an arrangement built on mutual necessity and actual fondness, which Cole thought was probably the best foundation for most things. He clocked in, collected his cart, and began with the lower floors. Conference rooms, break rooms, the marble lobby with its perpetually smudged glass doors. By 1 a.m., he was on the executive floors, which were quieter and cleaner than the lower levels because fewer people worked there, and those who did tended to be the type who cleaned up after themselves from some deeply ingrained sense of proprietary tidiness. The CEO's office was usually empty by the time he got there. Naomi Holloway's days were long. He gathered this from the timestamps on documents he sometimes saw left out, from the fact that the wastepaper basket beside her desk was always full. But even she seemed to leave by 8 or 9 most evenings. Tonight, the office was dark except for the light above her desk, which was left on, Cole had noticed, every night. He let himself in with the building master key, propped the door, and started with the far side of the room, working toward the desk. He'd been cleaning this office for about 8 months. He'd developed a routine the way you do: trash, surfaces, floor, windows if they needed it. He knew the room well enough that he barely had to think about it, which was usually a comfortable kind of work, the body occupied while the mind drifted wherever it needed to go. But tonight he noticed something that pulled him back. There was a wastebasket beside the credenza that he hadn't emptied yet, smaller than the main one, tucked partially behind a potted plant. He reached for the liner and stopped. Inside, a cluster of tissues, dark-stained, and within the tissues, tangled and clearly fallen out rather than deliberately placed, a small clump of hair. Dark, long, unmistakably hers. He'd seen Naomi Holloway in person twice when she'd been working late, and he'd come in to empty trash, and her hair was distinctive. The amount was unusual. Not alarming in isolation, maybe. But Cole had been in hazmat long enough to know that single data points are usually noise, and patterns are the thing worth watching. He filed it, knotted the bag, set it aside. He continued to the desk. The surface was tidier tonight than usual. A stack of documents, a pen in the groove of the organizer, the tablet charging in its stand. And there, on the corner of the desk, the picture. He'd seen it before. He'd cleaned around it every time. It was the kind of object that read as deliberate wellness, expensive, artisanal, the kind of thing purchased with intention. He'd assumed it was decorative or maybe for plants, but there was always a glass beside it, and the glass had residue in it, citrus smelling, which suggested it was being used. Tonight, for some reason. Maybe because of the hair, maybe because of the tissues, maybe because his brain was doing what it still occasionally did without asking permission, he leaned closer to the picture. The smell was faint, very faint. He almost dismissed it. Almost. He straightened, stood still, and consciously directed his attention back at the picture. He leaned in again, 3 inches away, and breathed. Garlic, a metallic undercurrent beneath it, the specific combination that, if you'd worked in industrial chemical assessment for 7 years, meant one thing before it meant anything else. Cole stood up and looked at the picture for a long moment. He thought about the hair, the stained tissues. He thought about the wheelchair and the way she'd looked, not unwell exactly, but fragile in a specific systemic way that didn't match the sharpness in her face, her voice, her manner. He thought about white lines on fingernails, which he'd noticed once when she'd signed something in his presence. Thin, horizontal, crossing both index fingers. He'd registered it as unusual and then moved on, because it wasn't his business. He was starting to think maybe he'd moved on too fast. The next 3 weeks were not comfortable for Cole. He did what he always did when something caught in his brain and wouldn't let go. He researched. Quietly, after Iris was asleep, at the kitchen table with his laptop, drinking coffee he didn't need at 11 o'clock at night. He pulled up everything he could find on arsenic exposure and its effects on the nervous system. He cross-referenced symptom lists with what he'd observed. The hair loss, the paralysis, the tissue staining, the nail lines. He found the medical term, Mace's lines, a classic sign of arsenic poisoning. He read about how arsenic accumulated slowly in the body, how it mimicked the presentation of neurological disease, how it had been missed by doctors for months or years in documented cases, partly because nobody was looking for it, and partly because the more plausible-seeming diagnosis had already taken hold. He read about unglazed clay pottery, about how certain traditional clay used in imported ceramics contained naturally occurring heavy metals, including arsenic, and how those metals could leach into the contents of the vessel over time, particularly in an acidic solution, like, for example, lemon water. He typed that last part and sat looking at it for a while. This was the part where he had to be careful, the part where he had to account for the fact that he was not a doctor, that he was a man who cleaned offices and used to work in chemical safety and was now, at midnight, piecing together a theory about his employer's employer based on a smell and a trash bag and things he'd observed while mopping floors. He could be wrong. He probably was wrong in some dimension. He didn't know enough about her specific diagnosis or treatment or medical history to be confident of anything, but the smell was real, the symptoms were real, the picture was real, and the combination of those three things was not something he could dismiss with any intellectual honesty, because intellectual honesty was something Cole had always taken seriously. It was more or less the foundation of hazmat work, the insistence on calling a thing what it was instead of what you'd prefer it to be. He thought about what to do with this for a long time. The options, as he mapped them out, were not great. He could tell Marcus, Naomi's assistant, and Marcus would almost certainly think he'd lost his mind. He could write an anonymous note, which was cowardly and easily ignored. He could go directly to her, which was the only approach that had any real chance of being taken seriously, and which was also the approach most likely to result in him being fired or escorted out of the building, or both. Or he could do nothing, which was the option that kept surfacing and that he kept refusing to take seriously, because he'd looked at those symptom lists and he understood what progressive arsenic poisoning meant over time. It meant nerve damage. It meant failure of multiple organ systems. It meant, left unaddressed, a clock running in a direction that only went one way. He thought about Iris. He thought about the mortgage equivalent of this job, the Mrs. Alvarez arrangement, the Penguin book in the back seat. He thought about all the reasonable, sensible arguments for staying in his lane. And then he thought about the pitcher sitting on that desk and a woman drinking 2 liters of lemon water from it every day for over a year, and how nobody in her life, not the expensive doctors, not the assistants, not the board members or the business contacts, had thought to look at what was right in front of her. It took him 4 more nights to get up the nerve. He'd arranged it carefully. He waited for a night when the building was thin, a Tuesday, mid-month, when even the late-working executives tended to be gone by 10. He arrived at his usual time, did his usual floors, and at 12:30 came to the executive level. Her office was lit. He could see it from the elevator. The frosted glass panel beside the door glowed in the way it did when her desk lamp was on. And as he got closer, he could see the door slightly ajar, which it never was when she wasn't there. He knocked. No answer. He pushed the door open 6 inches. Naomi Holloway was at her desk. She was not working. She was sitting in the chair with her hands in her lap and her head angled slightly to the left. And it took Cole 2 full seconds to understand that she was conscious, but that something was wrong. A quality of stillness that wasn't rest, that was something more like inability. Miss Holloway. Her eyes came up. The sharpness was still there, but dimmed or maybe redirected inward, like a light through a dirty window. It's passing, she said. Her voice was slurred at the edges, not badly, but enough. I've had these episodes. Go ahead and clean. I'll be out of your way in a few minutes. He didn't move. She looked at him more directly. You can start somewhere else. I'm fine. I don't think you should drink any more of that tonight, Cole said. He nodded toward the pitcher and the glass. The glass was half empty. She'd been drinking. The pitcher sat on the desk between them like something completely ordinary. Naomi's expression shifted. Not anger exactly. More like the face of someone recalibrating. I'm sorry? Cole came the rest of the way into the room. He held the door with his foot, which he was aware was odd, but he wanted a clear path out if she called security in the next 2 minutes. My name is Cole Bennett, he said. I've been on the night cleaning crew here for 8 months. Before that, I worked in industrial hazardous materials assessment for 7 years. He paused. I think I need to tell you something, and I'm asking you to let me finish before you ask me to leave. She looked at him for a moment. He couldn't fully read her face. She was very good at not having a face that gave things away easily, but she didn't reach for the phone. She didn't call out. All right, she said. Cole moved closer to the desk and stopped. I've noticed some things over the last few weeks, he said. He kept his voice level. Not clinical, not alarmed. The same tone he'd used 100 times in safety assessments, when you needed people to hear the information without the noise of your own emotional response getting in the way. The hair in the wastebasket, the tissues, the lines on your nails, which I noticed about 2 months ago when you signed something in the lobby. He paused. And the smell from the pitcher. She said nothing. I know how this sounds, Cole continued. I know you have doctors, specialists, a diagnosis, a treatment plan. I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm saying there's a smell from that pitcher that I've worked around in industrial contexts. It's very faint. Most people would walk past it every day and not notice. He stopped. I noticed. The silence in the room had a particular texture. Outside, 43 floors down, the city moved without them. What kind of smell? Naomi said. Not a question exactly. Flat. Garlic. Metallic underneath. That specific combination is what you get from arsenic off-gassing, in my experience. He said it clearly, without softening it. The symptom cluster you're presenting, and I'm going from observation, I'm not claiming to know your full history, the progressive numbness, the paralysis, the hair loss, the nail lines. Those are consistent with chronic arsenic exposure. She was looking at the pitcher now. The vessel is unglazed clay, Cole said. Imported. You drink lemon water from it, which is acidic. Acid draws metals out of porous clay. He'd rehearsed this part. He'd been careful with the sequencing, the way he would have been in a written report. If the clay has naturally occurring arsenic in it, which happens with certain regional soils, certain manufacturing processes, and you've been drinking from it daily for a year or more, 14 months, she said, almost to herself, then the levels in your system could be significant. Naomi Holloway stared at the pitcher. Cole watched her face work through something. Not panic. She clearly wasn't someone who went to panic quickly, but something harder and more complicated than that. Revision. The slow, nauseating process of rearranging what you believed was true about your own body, your own doctors, your own life, in light of a piece of information that had just arrived from a direction you were never looking. You worked in hazardous materials, she said. 7 years, assessment and remediation. Industrial sites, mostly, but also some residential and commercial contexts. And you're a janitor. He didn't flinch at it. Yes. In my building. Yes. For 8 months. Right. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were clearer. Or rather, she'd redirected the full force of her attention, and when Naomi Holloway put her full attention on something, Cole would later understand it was like a physical sensation in the room. If you're right, she said, I should have been tested for arsenic poisoning 14 months ago, before I started drinking from that pitcher. You should have been tested as a matter of baseline, Cole said. It's in most comprehensive toxicology panels. It's not always included in neurological workups. She said nothing for a moment. My lead physician recommended the pitcher, she said. It wasn't a defense, it was a statement of something that was becoming, as she said it out loud, newly significant. I know. You know. I noticed the prescription card propped against it, the letterhead. I read it when I was cleaning. This apparently was the thing that landed. She looked at him differently for a second, the way someone does when they realize they've been studied in a way they didn't know about. You read it, she said. I wasn't snooping, he said. It was on the desk. I noticed things. I've spent a lot of years in work where noticing things is the entire job. He paused. I'm sorry, I know this isn't a comfortable conversation. She made a sound that was almost a laugh, but didn't quite get there. No, she said. It is not. The next hour was not smooth. Naomi made 3 calls. Cole heard most of them from where he stood near the door, not wanting to leave and not sure he was supposed to stay. The first call was to Marcus, who clearly answered from his bed, and who she told, without explanation or apology for the hour, to arrange emergency toxicology testing, full panel, including heavy metals, including arsenic, first thing in the morning. The second call was to someone Cole gathered was her personal physician at the Reinhold practice. That call was shorter, and Naomi's voice during it was the kind of flat that meant she was managing something strong and cold beneath it. She didn't accuse, didn't explain. She simply said she'd been advised by someone with professional hazmat experience to order toxicology, and she would be doing so. The third call was to someone in building security, but not, it turned out, to have Cole removed. She was asking them to secure the pitcher, not throw it away, but bag it and hold it for testing. When she ended the last call, she was quiet for a moment. Cole was still near the door. "You live locally?" she asked. 20 minutes north, Ridgewood. "Family?" He hesitated for just a moment, not sure why she was asking. "A daughter, 6 years old." Something moved across her face, quick, almost invisible. "Who's with her tonight?" "My neighbor. She watches Iris on nights I work." Naomi nodded. Then she looked at the empty glass on the desk and the pitcher beside it, which building security hadn't collected yet, and something moved across her face that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite anger. It was something in between, the expression of a person who has just understood that they've been slowly losing something that was being slowly taken, and that the taking had been invisible, and that the invisibility might have been the point. "Mr. Bennett," she said. "Cole." She looked at him. "Cole." A pause. "I don't know what the results are going to say. I'm not prepared to tell you you're right, and I'm not prepared to tell you you're wrong." "I understand," he said, "but I'm also not going to dismiss this." She said it with the care of someone putting weight on something and testing it. "I want you to know that." Cole nodded. He put his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the pitcher in its bag. Building security had arrived quietly while Naomi was on her calls and collected it with the casual professionalism of people accustomed to odd requests from executives. "I appreciate that," he said. "Do you have a number I can reach you on?" He wrote it on the back of the prescription card she slid across the desk, the one from the Reinhold practice. He didn't comment on the symbolism of it, though he was aware of it, and from the slight change in her expression, so was she. "Go home to your daughter," Naomi said. He went. The drive back to Ridgewood at 2 a.m. was one of those drives that happens in a kind of sealed quiet. The city emptied out, the lights becoming intermittent as the streets narrowed from commercial to residential, the radio off because Cole hadn't turned it on. He pulled into the parking lot behind his building and sat in the car for a few minutes. The purple backpack was in the back seat. The Penguin book had slid off the seat to the floor at some point in the last few days, and he reached back now and picked it up without thinking about it, just to put it somewhere better. He thought about the smell from the pitcher, that specific, faint, metallic garlic. The thing about smells is that you can't unhear them. You can't unnotice a pattern once you've seen it. He thought about her face when she'd said 14 months, and the flatness in her voice that wasn't absence of feeling, but the particular way some people contain feeling in order to keep operating. He thought about Iris, upstairs in Mrs. Alvarez's apartment, asleep in the guest bed with a picture of penguins on the screen of her tablet. He thought about the way Naomi Holloway, in the moment when she'd asked about his daughter, had looked briefly and genuinely like a person who wasn't a CEO. He didn't know what happened next. The test results could come back clean. She could decide he'd overstepped, have him move to a different shift, make the whole thing go quietly away. He'd be fine either way. He knew what he'd seen. He knew what the smell meant. He'd done what you do when you know something that matters. You say it, and then what happens with it is out of your hands. He went upstairs. Mrs. Alvarez's door was unlocked, as arranged. Iris was asleep in the guest bedroom, one arm flung over the edge of the mattress, her hair tangled from moving around, a small, harmless disaster of blankets and stuffed animals. Cole stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at her, which he always did and which never got less necessary. He moved her arm back onto the bed, straightened the blankets without waking her, and kissed the top of her head. In the kitchen, Mrs. Alvarez had left him a covered plate, rice and beans, and some kind of braised chicken, a paper towel folded into a tent over the fork, He sat at her table and ate it at 2:30 in the morning, and the food was good, and outside the kitchen window the city was finally, almost, quiet. He would go home in a few hours. Wake Iris up, make eggs, take her to school, do the handoff with Mrs. Alvarez about the grocery list, fix the taillight on the Civic, which he kept telling himself he was going to do. But sitting there in the borrowed kitchen, his jacket hung over the chair back, the city outside not quite still, Cole Bennett sat with the knowledge of what he'd done, and what it might or might not mean, and he felt, not proud exactly, not that, just clear, like he'd looked at something honestly and said it out loud, which, as it turned out, was the hardest thing most people never quite managed to do. The results came back on a Thursday. Cole was asleep when his phone rang. He'd gotten home at 3, been in bed by 4, and it was now just past 9 in the morning, which meant he'd had 5 hours, which was not enough, but was what there was. He stared at the ceiling for 2 rings before picking up, not recognizing the number. "Mr. Bennett," Naomi's voice, no preamble. "Are you available to come in this morning?" He sat up. Iris was already at school. He dropped her off at 7:30, bleary, subsisting on coffee. "Yeah," he said. "I can come in." "Not the building. There's a medical office on Crane Street, the Halloran Center. I'm sending the address now." A pause, brief enough to almost not exist. "The results are back." He was there by 10:30. The Halloran Center was not the kind of medical facility that announced itself. No large signage, no sliding glass doors, just a narrow brownstone with a brass plate on the door and a waiting area that felt more like a private library than a clinic. Naomi was already there, in the consultation room, when a staff member showed Cole in. Marcus was with her, standing near the window in the way he always stood, slightly removed, ready to be useful without being in the way. There was a doctor Cole hadn't met, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain and a directness that felt like relief after too much professional hedging. She introduced herself as Dr. Priya Osei, a toxicologist. She had a printed report open on the table. "I'll go through this quickly," Dr. Osei said, "because I think plain language is going to serve everyone better than a lot of clinical framing." She looked at Naomi, then at Cole, then back to the report. "Your blood arsenic level is 78 micrograms per liter. The upper reference range for a healthy adult is 23. Your urine arsenic is approximately 4 times the upper threshold. These are not borderline numbers." Nobody said anything. "We also ran hair analysis," Dr. Osei continued. "Hair is useful because it records exposure over time. Roughly a centimeter a month of growth corresponds to a month of exposure history. The levels are elevated across 14 to 15 months of growth, increasing toward the most recent end, which suggests the exposure has been continuous and has likely been escalating as the compound effect accumulated." Naomi was looking at the report. Her face was the controlled face, the one that appeared in magazine photographs, the one that sat across boardroom tables. But her hands, folded on the table in front of her, were pressed too hard together. "The clinical picture, doctor," Osei said carefully, "is consistent with chronic arsenic poisoning presenting as progressive peripheral neuropathy. The paralysis, the sensory loss, the muscle weakness, these are the neurological effects of sustained heavy metal accumulation. They're not the effects of a primary neurological disease." The room was very quiet. Cole looked at Naomi. "So the diagnosis," Marcus started. "Was wrong," Naomi said. Flat, not a question. Dr. Osei chose her words. "The diagnosis was made in good faith based on presenting symptoms, without the benefit of a toxicology workup that would have identified the underlying cause. It happens. Heavy metal poisoning is a skilled mimic, but yes, the underlying cause is the arsenic, not a primary neurological condition." Naomi lifted her eyes from the report and looked directly at Cole for the first time since he'd come into the room. He met her gaze. He didn't look away and he didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say that the numbers hadn't already said better. "The picture has been sent to an independent materials lab," Dr. Osei continued. "We're expecting those results within 48 hours, but based on what Mr. Bennett described regarding the vessel, the contents, and the method of use, acidic liquid, unglazed clay, room temperature, daily consumption over an extended period, the mechanism is consistent." Acid accelerates leaching from porous ceramics. If the raw clay contained arsenic-bearing mineral deposits, which occurs in certain regional soils, the leaching rate into an acidic solution like citrus water would be significant and would increase with repeated use. It would be worse over time, Cole said. It wasn't a question, but he said it for the room's benefit. The way you name something out loud to make sure everyone has the same shape of it in their head. Correct, Dr. Osei said. The porosity increases slightly with use, and the mineral deposits would be drawing closer to the surface as the initial layers leached away. 14 months of daily 2-liter consumption from a progressively leaching vessel would produce exactly the kind of accelerating curve we see in the hair analysis. Naomi was still looking at Cole. You figured this out from a smell, she said. And the symptom pattern, he said. And 7 years of getting paid to be paranoid about what you can't see. She held his gaze for another second, then looked back at the report. Something in her face was cracking, very slightly, around the edges. Not breaking, just showing. The way old paint shows the material beneath it when the temperature changes. What does treatment look like? She said to Dr. Osei. Chelation therapy, primarily. It's a chemical process that binds the arsenic in your bloodstream so it can be filtered and excreted. It's effective, but it's not fast. Given the accumulation over 14 months, I'd estimate you're looking at several months of intensive treatment before we see substantial improvement in the neurological symptoms. Dr. Osei paused. The good news, and there is good news, is that peripheral neuropathy caused by arsenic poisoning is largely reversible with successful detoxification. The nerves can repair themselves once the toxic load is cleared. You will likely see significant functional recovery, but I want to be honest with you. I can't guarantee full recovery, and I can't give you a precise timeline. Everyone's nervous system responds differently. But she'll walk again, Marcus said from the window. He said it quietly, almost to himself, and then seemed to realize he'd said it out loud and looked at the floor. Dr. Osei looked at Naomi. I think that's a reasonable expectation to hold. Not a certainty, but a reasonable expectation. Naomi nodded once. A small, precise nod that contained a great deal of things she wasn't saying. The meeting ended with logistics, treatment scheduling, follow-up appointments, a referral to a specialist in neurotoxicology at a hospital across town. Cole stood to leave, and Naomi said his name. I'll be in touch, she said. Once I've dealt with some things on the other end, I want to talk with you again. Okay, he said. He went back out into the November street, where it had started to rain sometime in the last hour, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment pulling on his jacket, and thought that the word okay was doing a lot of work in that exchange, but that he didn't know a better word for whatever this was becoming. The things Naomi had to deal with on the other end were considerable. The first was Dr. Aldrich Reinhold. She did not call him. She had Marcus arrange a meeting at the office, her building, her ground, which was a choice that anyone who had worked with Naomi for longer than 6 months would have recognized immediately as intentional. When Reinhold arrived, he was composed, well-dressed, carrying the particular ease of a man who had spent his career managing difficult conversations with difficult patients in controlled environments. He came in expecting, Cole would later gather from Marcus's account, some kind of continuation of the treatment plan discussion. He was not expecting what he found. Naomi was at her desk. The picture was not. In the space where it had lived for 14 months, there was nothing. A clean corner of the desk surface that looked slightly more exposed than the rest of the room, the way a wound looks after a bandage comes off. She let him sit down. She waited a moment, the way she sometimes did before a negotiation. Not for effect, but because she was running through the options one final time. Then she put Dr. Osei's printed report on the desk and slid it across to him. Reinhold looked at the report. His face processed the numbers, the header, the specialist's name. Cole would have given a great deal to see the exact quality of what crossed the man's face in that moment. But Marcus, who was there, described it afterward as a careful blankness that arrived very quickly, which is not the blankness of innocence, but of a man whose brain has recognized something and chosen, in that same fraction of a second, to manage the recognition rather than show it. Arsenic poisoning, Naomi said. Chronic. 14 months. Sourced from the treatment vessel you recommended. Reinhold's response was careful and not quite sufficient. He said, with genuine composure, which was its own kind of damning, that he was shocked, that this was deeply concerning to him, that he would of course cooperate fully with any investigation, that imported ceramics were not something he'd had reason to believe carried contamination risk, that his recommendation had been based on published research. Naomi listened to all of it. "I have 3 questions," she said when he finished. He waited. "Where did the picture come from? Specifically, what supplier, what country of origin, and what other patients did you recommend it to?" Reinhold said he would need to check his records. "That's fine," Naomi said. "My legal team will be in touch to facilitate that." She paused. "Second question. In 14 months of treating a patient with a progressive neurological presentation, is there a reason comprehensive toxicology was never ordered as a differential diagnostic?" He began to answer. She held up a hand, not aggressive, just firm. "You don't have to answer that now. That one's also going to be a conversation between lawyers." She lowered her hand. "Third question is just for me." She looked at him steadily. "Were you ever curious?" He blinked. "I'm sorry?" "When the symptoms kept getting worse, when the treatments didn't produce meaningful improvement, when I kept declining." She wasn't heated. If anything, she was quieter than she'd been since he'd sat down. "Were you ever curious about what you might be missing, or were you satisfied with the diagnosis you had?" The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from the ones earlier in the day. This one had shape and weight, and Reinhold sat inside it without finding an answer that worked. "You can go," Naomi said. After he left, Marcus said she stayed at her desk for a long time without doing anything, which was unusual enough that he mentioned it, and she finally looked up and said, "Get me Dr. Osei's scheduling coordinator. I want to start treatment this week." "This week," he said. "Are you sure? There's the Frankfurt Summit on Friday, and the Caldwell Group is expecting—" "Marcus." "Yeah. This week." He got Dr. Osei's coordinator on the phone within the hour. Naomi started chelation therapy on a Saturday morning in a private treatment room at the neurotoxicology center that Dr. Osei had referred her to. The specialist there was a man named Dr. Ferris, young for his field, precise, the kind of doctor who explained things in layers, starting with the simplest version and going deeper when you wanted him to. Naomi always wanted him to go deeper. The therapy itself was not dramatic. An IV line, a drip, several hours in a room that had been made pleasant without quite succeeding. Good chairs, a view of a courtyard, a stack of current magazines that she mostly ignored. She brought work. She always brought work. But on that first Saturday, she found she couldn't actually focus on it. Her attention kept moving sideways, returning to things she'd rather have left alone. She thought about the photographs on the credenza, the one from Jakarta, specifically. Standing, laughing, 3 years ago. She thought about every appointment she'd attended, every treatment she'd submitted to, every specialist she'd flown to consult. The amount of money was almost irrelevant. She could afford it. That had never been the limiting factor. What she'd spent that couldn't be recovered was time. 15 months of her life in a body she'd been slowly losing. A body that was being actively damaged every day by something she was consuming voluntarily, in good faith, on the recommendation of a physician she'd trusted. She was not a person who cried easily or often. She hadn't cried yet about any of this, and she wasn't going to now. In a treatment room in a private medical facility with an IV in her arm. But she sat with something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite rage and wasn't quite relief. It was all of those together, unresolved, the way those feelings usually come. What she kept coming back to was Cole. Not in a sentimental way. She wasn't built for sentimentality, and she knew it about herself without apology. But she kept turning the fact of him over, the way you turn an object in your hands when it doesn't quite fit any category you already have. A man who cleaned offices for a living, who had 7 years of industrial safety experience and a 6-year-old daughter who liked penguins and who had noticed, because he was the kind of person who notices things, the faint chemical smell and the hair in the wastebasket and the lines on her nails. The world's finest specialists had looked at her case and built a story, and then continued building it, and then continued treating the story instead of the patient. Cole had walked into her office after midnight with a cleaning cart and looked at the desk and smelled something wrong. There was something in that worth sitting with. She wasn't sure yet what it was exactly, but she sat with it anyway. 3 weeks into treatment, she called him. Cole was at home. A Sunday afternoon, Iris was at the kitchen table doing a worksheet about animal habitats, and he was making chili that was going to take about an hour longer than it needed to because he kept getting distracted. His phone buzzed on the counter. He looked at the number, and the number was the one from the Crane Street medical office that he'd entered into his contacts under Holloway, and then felt slightly odd about. Ms. Holloway, how many times am I going to have to correct that? She said it flatly. Probably at least once more, he said. A pause that might have been the beginning of a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Are you at home? Yeah, making chili. I won't keep you. Another pause. I wanted to tell you the treatment is going. Dr. Ferris is satisfied with the early response. The blood levels have already started to come down. That's good. Yes. A beat. I also heard from the materials lab. The pitcher tested positive for arsenic-bearing mineral deposits in the clay body. The leaching rate at citrus pH over 12 months of use was calculated to be, well, Dr. Osei called it unambiguously causal. Cole leaned against the kitchen counter. I'm glad they tested it. So am I. She paused. My legal team has been dealing with Reinhold's practice. I'm not going to detail that conversation, but they found 2 other patients he'd recommended similar wellness products to. A different brand, but the same category. Unglazed imported ceramics. Both of those patients have now been referred for toxicology. Cole was quiet for a moment. He hadn't thought about other patients. He should have, he realized. The logic of it was obvious once you saw it. But he'd been so focused on the one situation in front of him that the broader picture hadn't assembled itself yet. Are they? He started. One has elevated levels, lower than mine, shorter exposure period. The other is clear, but they wouldn't have known to test without... She stopped. Without this having surfaced. He didn't say anything. In the kitchen doorway, Iris had appeared, worksheet in hand, waiting to ask a question. She saw he was on the phone and made the face she made, a kind of comical, exaggerated patience, and leaned against the doorframe. I wanted you to know, Naomi said. I'm not sure I know how to say the rest of it yet, but I wanted you to know the treatment is working and the lab confirmed it. Thank you for telling me, he said. How's your daughter? The question surprised him, not because it was intrusive, but because it was specific. She'd remembered. She's good. Standing in my kitchen right now with the patience of someone who has a very important question about animal habitats. Then I'll let you go. A pause. Cole? Yeah. I'm going to want to talk with you again, not on the phone. When I'm further along in the treatment and some of the other pieces have settled, I want to have a real conversation. Okay, he said. Okay, she said back, and hung up. He put the phone down on the counter and looked at Iris. Who was that? She asked. Someone from work. From the cleaning job? Sort of. Iris looked at the phone, then at him, with the focused skepticism of a 6-year-old who could tell when adults were being imprecise. What does sort of mean? It means it's a little complicated, and I'll explain it when you're older. He gestured at the worksheet. What's the question about habitats? She came into the kitchen, still watching him with that look. Do penguins count as marine animals or land animals? Both, he said. They live in both. That's part of what makes them interesting. She considered this with genuine seriousness. So they don't fit in one category? No, he said, they don't. She seemed to find this satisfying in some way he didn't fully follow and went back to the table, and Cole turned back to the chili. And outside the kitchen window, the afternoon was doing what November afternoons did, going gray-gold and quiet, the light pulling back towards something more honest. The weeks that followed were strange in the particular way that strange things become normalized when you're living them daily. Cole continued working his shift. He continued cleaning the 43rd floor, the executive offices, the glass-paneled corridor. The corner of Naomi's desk where the pitcher had been remained empty. Nobody had put anything there, which Cole noticed every time without quite being able to explain why it mattered. He didn't see Naomi in the office much. She was working differently now. More remote days, more mid-morning arrivals that avoided the peak staff hours. He gathered from fragments of conversation he overheard, between Marcus and the front desk coordinator, between two executives in the elevator, that the chelation therapy required frequent clinical visits and that she was managing the company largely from wherever she happened to be receiving treatment. The board had been told something, not everything, he guessed, and were apparently being managed with the careful containment that Naomi seemed to apply to most human systems that threatened to become chaotic. One evening in early December, Cole came off the elevator on 43 and found the office door open and Naomi at the desk, working, at 11:30 at night. She looked up when he knocked on the open door. "I didn't expect you in," he said. "I had things to finish." She looked less diminished than she had that first night he'd found her unmoving in the chair. Not better exactly. Not yet, but present in a way that had a different quality. "Come in. You can start the room." He came in and went through his routine, and they were in the same space without talking for a while, which was not uncomfortable. Cole had spent enough time in buildings at night to know that silence between people could be either absence or presence, and this was the second kind. "My mother called me today," Naomi said, at some point, not looking up from her screen. He wasn't sure she was talking to him, so he didn't respond immediately. "She lives in Phoenix. We talk once a week, more or less. I haven't told her about this." She paused. "Any of it? The arsenic, the treatment, none of it?" "How come?" She looked up then. "Because telling her would mean admitting how long I'd been keeping the rest of it from her. The extent of the decline, the real picture." She looked at her screen again. She knew I used the wheelchair. She didn't know how completely things had deteriorated. Cole folded the liner on the second wastebasket and set it aside. "Are you going to tell her?" "I'm going to have to, eventually. Once there's something better to tell along with the hard parts." She paused. "That's probably cowardice." "Or strategy," he said. "Those can look similar." She made that almost sound again, the one that wanted to be a laugh and hadn't quite decided. "That's generous." "Not especially." He moved to the windows with the microfiber cloth. "My daughter's mother left when Iris was 8 months old. Sent me a message. I didn't tell Iris until she was 4, which was maybe a year longer than I should have waited. He didn't usually tell people that. It came out of him without consulting the usual filtration system, which he suspected was a side effect of late-night silence and the way Naomi had offered her own incomplete thing first. "How did Iris take it?" Naomi asked, and her voice had shifted slightly. Still controlled, but the kind of controlled that comes from genuine attention rather than professional management. "She cried. Then she asked if she could have a dog instead, so I think she processed it in her own way." He moved along the window. "She doesn't have a dog, but she has penguins." "The book." "The book, yes, and now penguin socks and a poster. It's a whole thing." Naomi was quiet for a moment. "You raised her alone from 8 months." "Yeah." "And then the job loss." "And then that, yeah." She didn't say anything for a moment. The thing about Naomi Holloway, Cole was coming to understand, was that she didn't perform sympathy. She either felt something and was quiet about it, or she didn't feel it and said nothing, and the quality of her silences was different enough in those two cases that you could tell them apart. "I've been thinking about something," she said. He waited. "When I'm through the treatment, when the levels are down and the nerve function has improved enough that I have some sense of where I'm landing, I want to talk to you about a role at the company." Cole stopped. He had the cloth in his hand and he turned and looked at her. "Not as a favor," she said before he could respond. "I need to be clear about that. I am not a person who offers things out of sentiment." She held his gaze. "I've spent 14 months thinking my company's safety protocols were somebody else's problem. I have a global operation, distribution terminals, processing centers, warehouses on 3 continents, and I've been staffing environmental and materials safety as a compliance checkbox rather than a function that matters." She paused. "And then a man who spent 7 years in hazmat walked into my office and noticed something in 30 seconds that a year's worth of medical specialists missed." Cole said nothing. "I'm not saying you saved my life because you're special," she said. It was blunt, not unkind. "I'm saying you saved my life because you paid attention, and because you had the background to understand what you were seeing, and because you said something when the easier choice was not to." She looked at him steadily. I'd like that in my company, in a role that actually has authority and scope. Cole looked at the cloth in his hand. He thought about the parking lot, the cracked taillight, the grocery list for Mrs. Alvarez, the booster seat. I'm not corporate, he said. I know that. I don't have a business degree. I have a technical certification and 7 years of field work and 3 years of cleaning offices. I know that too. Then what does the role actually look like? His voice was level, not skeptical exactly, just careful. He was a person who'd learned to be careful about the shapes of offers. I don't know yet, she said. That's part of what I want to talk through, when the time is right. She paused. Not tonight. Tonight I wanted to tell you I was thinking about it. He looked at her for a moment. The woman in the wheelchair in the lit office, the city 43 floors below, the corner of the desk where the picture had been. Okay, he said. When the time is right. He finished the room. She was still working when he left, the light above her desk warm against the dark glass of the windows, and the city was doing what it always did at midnight, persisting, imperfect, still moving, still lit, not waiting for anything to be resolved before it kept going. The first real sign came on a Tuesday in January. Naomi was in the treatment room at the Neurotoxicology Center, her third session of the week, which was the schedule Dr. Ferris had moved her to after the 6-week blood work showed the chelation was pulling arsenic out faster than the initial projections. The sessions were long, and the room was the same room it always was, pleasant without succeeding, and Naomi had given up pretending to work during them and had started instead just sitting with the window and the courtyard view and the particular quiet of a Tuesday morning when most of the world was doing something else. She was watching a sparrow on the courtyard ledge when she felt it. Not pain, the opposite of pain almost. A faint warmth along the outside of her left foot. The kind of sensation that healthy people don't notice because it's so constant and ordinary that it registers as nothing. The simple fact of a foot existing, being there, reporting back. She sat very still. The warmth moved slightly. Not her moving it, just it being there. The nerve carrying its small ordinary message up through the pathways that had been going dark for over a year. She pressed her foot against the footrest of the wheelchair gently and felt the pressure. Not fully, not the way she used to, but something, an unmistakable something. She didn't call anyone. She sat with it for the remaining 40 minutes of the session and said nothing to the nurse monitoring her drip because she'd learned by then that medical hope was a thing you handled carefully, that you didn't expose it too soon or too directly to the air because it was fragile in the early stages and the world had a way of complicating fragile things. She told Dr. Ferris at her next appointment 2 days later. He listened, tested her reflexes, ran a brief sensory assessment, and then looked up from the chart with the measured expression of someone making a genuine effort not to overstate things. This is consistent with what I'd expect to see at this point in treatment, he said. The blood arsenic is down to 31. Still elevated, but the acute toxic load is reduced significantly. The peripheral nerves they're beginning to repair. It's slow. It won't be linear. You'll have days where the sensation is there and days where it feels like you've lost ground. I know, Naomi said. I've been living in a non-linear body for 16 months. I understand the concept. The edge in her voice wasn't directed at him, and he seemed to understand that. I just want to manage expectations. You manage them, she said. I'll manage mine. She drove back to the office, Marcus at the wheel because Naomi's hand function was still unreliable enough that driving wasn't safe, and sat in the car looking at her building's entrance for a moment before going in. The brass doors, the lobby with its perpetually smudged glass. 43 floors of a company she'd built from a regional freight operation into a global logistics network. Starting at 24 years old with a business plan and a borrowed conference room and a level of certainty that she now recognized with the clarity of hindsight had been partially performance. She'd always been good at performing certainty. The question she was sitting with lately was how much of that performance she still needed, and for whom. Doug. Cole found out about the sensation in her foot from Naomi herself, about a week after it happened. He'd been in the building doing his regular shift, and she'd been working late again. She was working later now than she had before, which Marcus had privately told him was partly recovery. That when your body has been in real danger, the work becomes something to hold on to, and she'd called him into the office when he came past with the cart. "I felt my foot," she said, without context, because that was how she operated. She'd been thinking about it long enough that it felt like a continuation of a conversation. Cole understood immediately. When? Tuesday. Treatment session. She was at the window, which she'd been doing more lately, sitting near the window rather than always behind the desk. He wasn't sure if she knew she was doing it. Just warmth and pressure when I pushed against the footrest. But it was there. Both feet? Just the left. The right is still mostly quiet. She looked at her hands, which were in her lap. The left hand has been better too. Grip is coming back. Not reliable, but present. Cole leaned against the doorframe. He'd stopped treating the doorframe as an escape route weeks ago. That's real progress. I know. She said it in a way that meant she was still getting used to knowing it. Dr. Ferris says the nerve repair is slow and nonlinear. I could have a bad week. I probably will. Probably. I'm not being pessimistic. I didn't say you were, Cole said. I said probably, which is accurate. You'll have bad days. Doesn't change what Tuesday was. She looked at him. This was something he'd noticed about their recent conversations. She had a way of looking at him that was different from how she looked at most people, which was to say she wasn't managing him. She wasn't performing anything at him or reading him for strategic information. She was just looking, the way you look at something you're trying to understand. Can I ask you something? She said. Yeah. The night you came in and found me in the chair. The really bad episode. She paused. I never asked how long you'd been standing outside the door before you knocked. Cole considered lying, or at least softening it, and decided against both. A few minutes. Working up to it. Working up to it, he confirmed. Were you scared? Not of you, he said. Of being wrong. He shifted against the doorframe. There's a version of that night where I walk in, say my piece, you call security, I get escorted out, I lose the job, which means a lot of other things get complicated. He didn't itemize them. He didn't have to. So yeah, I stood outside for a few minutes and ran through it again. And you came in anyway. You were sick. The evidence pointed one way. You can stand outside all night, but eventually the only honest choice is to knock. He paused. Or not knock, which is its own choice. Naomi looked at her lap. I've been thinking about Reinhold, she said. Not the legal situation. Marcus handles that. I've been thinking about, he's a smart man, genuinely, that practice, those publications. He's not an idiot. No, Cole agreed. So how does an intelligent, educated, experienced physician recommend a treatment that poisons his patient for 14 months without... She stopped. Without catching it? Without looking, she said. That's the part I can't get past. He stopped looking. He had a diagnosis and a treatment plan, and he stopped examining whether the picture was complete. Cole thought about that for a moment. It happens in industrial safety too, he said. Company gets certified, they've passed all the audits, the paperwork's clean, and then nobody looks at the actual site because the paperwork says it's fine. The documentation replaces the observation. He paused. It's easy to stop looking when you have a story that explains everything. She nodded slowly. He had my story, she said. Progressive neurological decline, unknown etiology, consistent with several documented conditions. It was a complete story. And the treatment wasn't making things worse in any way he was measuring, because he wasn't measuring arsenic levels. He was measuring the wrong things. He was measuring the right things for the wrong diagnosis. She was quiet for a moment, and I handed him that story too. I came in wanting answers, and I accepted the first coherent set of answers I was given by someone credentialed enough that it felt safe to accept them. Cole didn't say anything. That was her thing to sit with, not his to resolve. I'm not saying it was my fault, she said. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't. But I'm aware that I have a habit of deferring to expertise in areas I don't understand, and then not questioning the expertise once I've accepted it. She looked up. Which is ironic given how I run the company. How do you run the company? I question everything, she said. Constantly. Every assumption, every projection, every plan someone brings me. I push back, I ask what else it could be. I don't accept the first story. She paused. I just apparently don't do that for myself. Plus, most people don't, Cole said. It's harder with yourself. That's not an excuse. I didn't say it was. The office was quiet. Down below, 43 floors, the city was fully into its evening rhythm. Cole straightened off the door frame and picked up the cart handle. For what it's worth, he said, you questioned it fast when it mattered. When I told you, you didn't just dismiss it. You ordered the test the same night. I almost dismissed it, she said. I almost said thank you and waited for you to leave. But you didn't. She looked at the empty corner of the desk. No, I didn't. The board meeting in February was the first time anything close to the truth became available to people outside Naomi's immediate circle. She hadn't intended to say anything. The official position, handled through Marcus and the communications team, had been a vague reference to a medical treatment program being undertaken for a previously disclosed health condition, language so carefully nonspecific that it communicated almost nothing and therefore generated very little. The board had been managed through the same channel. Nobody had pushed, partly because Naomi's companies performed when she was present and performed nearly as well when she wasn't, which was by design. She'd always insisted on building systems that didn't require her personal attention every hour to function, which was possibly the best professional decision she'd ever made. But the February board meeting was quarterly review, and quarterly reviews required her physical presence. And her physical presence required her to sit in that room for 3 hours with 11 people who had been watching her decline for 16 months, and who deserved, she had finally decided, something closer to the truth. She didn't give them everything. She gave them the outline. The diagnosis had been wrong. The correct diagnosis was heavy metal toxicity from a contaminated treatment product. She was receiving effective treatment. The prognosis was good. Her functional capacity was already improving and was expected to continue improving over the following months. She watched their faces as she said it. Some of them she'd known for years. Gordon Marsh, who'd been on the board since the company was half its current size, who had the quality of a man who had seen a lot of things go wrong and had learned to stay quiet and steady when they did. Patricia Vene, who asked the sharpest questions of anyone in the room. Theo Adair, the youngest board member, who had always been the least comfortable with Naomi's more unconventional decisions, and who was looking at her now with an expression she couldn't quite read. It was Theo who asked the question that she'd expected and hadn't known how to answer. How was it caught? If the medical team managing the condition missed it for 14 months, what changed? Naomi looked at him. She'd considered this answer, run several versions of it, and had been dissatisfied with all of them because they all softened something that she didn't want softened. Someone on the facilities staff noticed an anomaly, she said. Chemical indicators in the treatment vessel combined with the symptom pattern. He had a background in industrial hazardous materials, and he brought it to my attention directly. A pause in the room. Facilities staff, Patricia Venn said. Cleaning crew specifically, night shift. Naomi kept her voice even. He's been in the building 8 months. The room processed this. Gordon Marsh, she noticed, looked briefly at the table with something on his face that might have been satisfaction, the expression of a person whose private belief about the world has just been confirmed. And the physician responsible? Theo asked. Handled through legal, Naomi said. That's not a board matter at this stage. I'd argue it is, given it's not. She said it without particular force, but the room understood the line. What is a board matter is what happens next operationally, and I want to use the remaining time today to talk about that. She moved the agenda forward, and the board followed, because that was generally what happened when Naomi Holloway decided to move something forward. But she noticed, for the rest of the meeting, the specific quality of attention in the room, people looking at her differently than they had before she'd said what she'd said. Not with pity, which she'd feared and would have found intolerable, with something else. An adjustment of understanding. She preferred it to the careful avoidance she'd gotten used to, but it still cost something to sit inside it. Cole got a call from Marcus on a Friday afternoon in late February while he was picking Iris up from school. Ms. Holloway would like to know if you're available for a meeting next week, Marcus said, in the voice he used for scheduling, pleasantly efficient, entirely neutral. Not the building. There's a lunch place on Mercer Street, Aldana's, Tuesday at noon. Iris was running toward him across the school blacktop, backpack bouncing, shouting something about a project. Tuesday at noon works, Cole said. Iris arrived at his side and grabbed his arm with both hands. Dad, we're doing a science project about ecosystems and I want to do the ocean. That's a big ecosystem, Cole said, into the phone and to his daughter approximately simultaneously. I'll tell her you confirmed, Marcus said. See you Tuesday. Cole pocketed the phone and looked at Iris. The ocean. Mrs. Perez said we can do any ecosystem we want, and I want to do the ocean because penguins live there. She squinted up at him. Sort of. They live there and on land. Like you said, they're both. That was about categories, he said, starting toward the car. Same thing. She was right, actually. He let it go. That weekend he thought about Tuesday more than was probably necessary. The offer Naomi had mentioned, the role at the company, the real conversation, was something he'd been sitting with carefully since December, the way you sit with a piece of information that has implications you haven't fully mapped yet. He wasn't naive about it. He understood that the dynamic between them was unusual, that the circumstances that had created it were not circumstances that repeated themselves in ordinary life, and that what someone says when they're processing shock and medical crisis is not always what they mean 3 months later when things have settled. He also understood from everything he'd observed about Naomi Holloway that she was not the kind of person who said things she didn't mean, and was also not the kind of person who reversed decisions made after genuine reflection. She was impulsive in some ways, quick, decisive, occasionally blunt in ways that made people in meetings visibly uncomfortable, but not careless. She said Tuesday at noon, she meant Tuesday at noon, still. He'd learned not to build too much on things that hadn't happened yet. He took Iris to the library Saturday morning and helped her find 3 books about ocean ecosystems, one of which had an entire chapter on penguins that she declared the best chapter in the history of books. And he sat in the chair beside her and read about current and tide structure while she annotated her notebook with a seriousness that suggested she'd either become a marine biologist or a very organized amateur. He thought about the version of his life where the layoffs hadn't happened and he'd stayed in industrial safety. He'd have a different job, probably a better apartment, maybe a car without a cracked taillight. He'd never have been in that building, never cleaned that office, never smelled whatever he'd smelled from that pitcher in whatever particular alignment of conditions had brought him close enough and focused him enough at exactly the right moment. He wasn't sure what to do with that. It wasn't a comfortable thought. The idea that things had worked out because things had gone wrong first. It felt too neat, and Cole had a fundamental distrust of neat. The world didn't run on neat. It ran on accident and effort and the occasional inexplicable alignment of circumstances that you couldn't plan for and couldn't have anticipated, and which you either noticed when they happened or you didn't. He'd noticed. That was the whole thing, in the end. Aldana's on Mercer Street was the kind of lunch place that managed to be both genuinely good and genuinely unpretentious, which in this city was an achievement worth respecting. Corner location, high ceilings, the kind of noise level that was lively without being overwhelming. Cole arrived 5 minutes early and was shown to a table near the window, and Naomi arrived 3 minutes later with Marcus, who seated her and then moved to a table 2 removed, which Cole recognized as a tactical arrangement, present if needed, absent for the conversation. She looked different, not dramatically. She was still in the wheelchair, still the composed public presence he'd been watching for months. But there was something in her face that had changed since December, a quality he didn't have a precise word for. Less defended, maybe. Not soft. Naomi Holloway was fundamentally not a soft person, but less committed to the appearance of being fine. You look better, he said, because it was true, and because he didn't know a better opening. I feel less like I'm losing, she said, which is different from feeling good, but it's an improvement. She looked at the menu briefly and set it down. The left leg is functional at about 60%, according to Dr. Ferris's assessment last week. The left hand is closer to 75. Right side is slower. Still improving? Still improving. A pause. Dr. Ferris thinks I'll be able to stand with support within the next month or 2. Actual walking, assisted with a physical therapist, within 3 to 4 months. What that looks like long-term depends on how much the nerve repair continues. That's good, Cole said. He meant it without qualification. It is. She looked at him. I owe you something I haven't said properly. You don't. I do, she said, with a firmness that wasn't unkind but that closed the door on his protest. I've been thinking about how to say it in a way that doesn't sound like a speech, because I hate speeches, and I don't think you like them either. So I'll just say it plainly. You walked into a bad situation at personal risk, and you told the truth when the easier thing was to walk back out. She paused. That's not small. I've been in business for 9 years, and I can tell you that people don't do it as often as they should. Cole looked at the table for a moment. I want to say it wasn't a big deal, but I'd be lying. Then don't say it. I know. He looked up. It cost something. To knock on that door. I want to be honest about that. I know it did, she said. The waiter came. They ordered. The restaurant moved around them with its usual lunchtime energy. A table of 4 near the center laughing at something, a man on his phone at the bar, outside on the street, a delivery cyclist navigating through stopped traffic. Normal life, fully in operation. I meant what I said in December, Naomi said when the waiter left. About the role. I know. I've had 3 months to think about what it would actually look like. I talked to my operations director quietly about what the gaps are. She paused. We have a global environmental and materials safety function that is staffed by people whose primary qualification is that they understand compliance documentation. They know how to pass audits. They don't know how to look at a site and identify what the audit doesn't ask about. Which is usually where the problem is, Cole said. Yes, which is exactly the problem. She leaned slightly forward. I want to build something that's less about checking boxes and more about what you do. Active assessment. Looking at what's actually in the building, what's actually in the materials, what people are actually being exposed to. On site, not paper-based. Cole folded his hands on the table. I haven't worked in that field in 3 years. Things change. New regulations, new materials, new testing protocols. I know. There would be a re-entry period. I'm not pretending you step in on Monday and overhaul a global operation by Thursday. There would be time to get current, to build the function from the ground up with the right support. She paused. What I'm not finding in my existing staff is the instinct. Whatever it is that makes a person lean into a smell at midnight instead of walking past it. She looked at him directly. You can't train that. You either have it or you don't. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the delivery cyclist had made it through the intersection and was moving down the street, picking up speed. I have a daughter, he said. I know. I'm not saying that as an excuse. I'm saying it because it's the primary variable in every decision I make. If this doesn't work, if it falls apart or turns out to be something different from what we're describing, the fallout lands on her too. I understand that, Naomi said. And I want to be transparent about what I'm offering so you can make an actual assessment. She named a number, base salary, annual review, benefits package. Cole kept his face even, but it was more than twice what he'd made in his last safety position and about 4 times what he was making now. Full health care, including dependent coverage. A pause, deliberate. I know about the pediatric cardiology appointments. Cole looked at her. Marcus does the background on people the company is considering for roles, she said without apology. I asked him to be thorough. Iris has a bicuspid aortic valve and has been monitored since 18 months. The fact that she knew this sat in the air between them. He'd known she was thorough. He hadn't known she'd been thinking about this long enough to have someone look into it. She's okay, he said, after a moment. It's being monitored. She doesn't need intervention now, maybe never will. But the monitoring appointments aren't cheap, and your current plan has a high deductible. No, he said, they're not cheap. She didn't say anything else about it. She didn't need to. The dependent coverage was part of the offer, and she'd told him she knew about Iris, and that was the whole communication. No ceremony around it, no performance of generosity. Just information. Cole looked at his hands. What would the title be, he said. Director of Environmental and Materials Safety, Global Scope. She paused. You'd report directly to me. Not through operations? Not through operations. This function should report to the CEO. That's one of the structural changes I'm making. She looked at him steadily. I want it to have real authority, not advisory, not consultative. The ability to halt operations at any facility where you identify an unacceptable risk. That was the part that landed differently than everything else. The salary was significant. The benefits were significant. But the authority to actually stop something, to walk into a distribution terminal and say, this is wrong and have it stopped, not reviewed, not escalated, stopped, that was different in kind. That was the thing the compliance documentation people didn't have and couldn't have because they were built to pass audits, not to make hard calls. I'd need time to get current on the regulatory landscape, he said. At minimum, a few months before I could meaningfully assess operations. Agreed. And I'd want to bring in a small team over time. I can't do global scope alone. Also agreed. You'd have hiring authority and budget. I'd want that in writing. It'll be in the contract. Cole looked at her. She looked back. The restaurant moved around them, ordinary and ongoing. I need to think about it, he said. Not because I'm uncertain, because I want to make sure I'm deciding for the right reasons. That's fair, she said. How long do you need? He thought about Iris's penguin book, the booster seat, the purple backpack, the library on Saturday morning, the life he'd built out of the pieces he'd been left with, which was not the life he'd planned, but which was, he knew this clearly, a real life, with real weight to it. A week, he said. Okay. She picked up her water glass. One more thing. Yeah. The condition you'd want to name, if you were going to name one non-negotiable before accepting. She said it the way she asked questions in board meetings, not as a test exactly, but as a genuine attempt to understand something. What is it? Cole didn't hesitate. He'd known the answer to this since December. Employee safety comes before the profit margin, he said, not as a principle we hang on a wall, as an actual operating reality. If I find something that needs to be fixed, it gets fixed, regardless of what it costs or what it disrupts. Naomi held his gaze. Yes, she said. No qualification, no hedge, no pause. He nodded. Outside, a cloud moved and the light through the window changed. The restaurant brightened slightly, the room's colors shifting a degree warmer. Neither of them commented on it. They finished lunch. They talked about the Frankfurt distribution hub, which Cole had heard about only in fragments, and about what a preliminary assessment of the company's existing safety documentation would look like, and about Iris's ocean ecosystem project, which Naomi asked a question about and seemed genuinely interested in the answer to. The conversation was not comfortable exactly. There were still too many layers of unresolved complexity between them, too much history packed into too short a time, too much that each of them was still in the process of becoming. But it was honest, and it moved, and it didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. Marcus drove her back to the office after. Cole walked to where he'd parked, 3 blocks over, and sat in the Civic for a moment. The cracked taillight caught the afternoon light at an angle. He'd been meaning to fix it for months. He'd fix it this weekend, he thought. That was something he could actually do this weekend. He started the car and pulled out into the street, and the city did what the city did. It moved around him, immediate and ongoing, not waiting for anyone to have everything figured out before insisting on being continued. Cole fixed the taillight on Saturday. It took him 40 minutes, a trip to the auto parts store with Iris, who treated the errand with the same focused attention she brought to ecosystem research, and a YouTube tutorial that was 11 minutes long and more complicated than the job actually turned out to be. When it was done, he stood behind the car and looked at it, and Iris stood beside him and looked at it, and she said it looked the same as before. And he said that was the point. And she seemed to find this philosophically unsatisfying, but moved on. That night, after she was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and did what he did when a decision had enough weight to it that he didn't trust himself to think it through in his head. He wrote things down, not a pros and cons list. He'd always found those reductive, the kind of tool that produces the illusion of clarity without the substance of it. He wrote more like he was describing the situation to someone who didn't know it, laying it out in full so he could read it back and see if the shape of it matched what he actually thought. He wrote about the offer, the title, the salary, the scope, the dependent health care, the direct reporting line, the authority clause. That one he'd underlined twice when he wrote it, not for emphasis but because it was the piece he kept returning to. The ability to halt operations. In 7 years of industrial safety work, he'd had the authority to recommend, to flag, to escalate. He'd never had the authority to stop. He knew, with the certainty of experience, how differently things went when the word was stop versus the word was concern. He wrote about Iris. About the cardiologist appointments and the deductible and the way he'd been managing the math of it for 3 years through a combination of the union health plan, from the cleaning job and a secondary plan he paid for out of pocket, and some months went smoother than others. About the fact that she was fine, genuinely fine, monitored and stable, and currently obsessed with marine biology, but that the monitoring was ongoing and the future was not something he could forecast. He wrote about the risk, that Naomi Holloway was not someone whose word he doubted, but that words and contracts were different things, and that the person making the offer might in 6 months or 2 years be replaced or overruled or changed by circumstances, and that he was building his daughter's stability on a foundation that had not been tested. He wrote about the cleaning job, not dismissively. He'd never been dismissive about it, but honestly, what it had given him and what it hadn't. The stability of routine, the invisibility, which had its uses and its costs. The way 3 years of being unseen in rooms had taught him something about the gap between what institutions presented about themselves and what they actually were when nobody was watching. He read it all back. Then he called Marcus the next morning and said he was in. The paperwork took 2 weeks. Cole had a lawyer, a friend from his industrial safety years who'd moved into employment law, a woman named Diane who read the contract with the focused skepticism of someone who'd seen the ways these things could go wrong and had a specific vocabulary for each of them. She came back with 7 questions and 2 suggested amendments. Naomi's legal team accepted both amendments without negotiation, which Diane noted afterward was either a very good sign or a sign that the company had significantly more leverage somewhere in the fine print that neither of them had found yet, and they went back through the whole document again before Cole signed. He signed on a Thursday morning in a conference room on the 43rd floor. Marcus witnessed it. Naomi was there across the table, and when Cole put the pen down, she looked at the signed page for a moment and then looked up at him. "Welcome," she said. "Thank you," he said. It was not a triumphant moment. It was more like the feeling at the beginning of a long drive. The awareness of distance ahead, the engine running, the route not entirely clear. His notice to the cleaning company was received by his supervisor, a tired man named Ron, who had seen people come and go for 20 years and who responded to Cole's resignation with the particular flatness of someone who had moved past being surprised by anything. "Good for you," Ron said, and meant it, Cole thought, in the specific way that people who are not leaving mean it for people who are. He worked his remaining 2 weeks. The last night he did the 43rd floor at his usual time, and when he came to Naomi's office, dark, she'd gone home at a reasonable hour for once, he stood in the doorway for a moment. The room was what it always was. The walnut desk, the scattered documents, the photographs on the credenza, the empty corner where the picture had been. He did the room the way he always did. Trash, surfaces, floor, windows. When he was done, he stood at the door and looked back at it once, the way you look at a place you're leaving, and then he turned the light off and went down to return the cart. The first month in the new role was not what Cole had expected, which he supposed was appropriate for a month that contained almost nothing he'd previously experienced. His office was on the 38th floor, not 43, which he'd been clear about. He didn't think operating 5 floors below the CEO was healthy for the function's independence, and Naomi had agreed with a pragmatism that suggested she'd already thought about the optics. The space was smaller than the executive suites above, which he preferred. He'd put a whiteboard on one wall, a map of the company's global facilities on another, and a printed copy of the contract's authority clause framed on the desk, not as decoration, but as a practical reminder of what the job actually was. He spent the first 3 weeks reading. The existing safety documentation, all of it. He went through the compliance reports from the last 4 years at every major facility, the audit findings, the corrective action logs, the materials lists for each site. He was looking for patterns, not violations necessarily, not the things that had already been flagged and addressed, but the gaps. The places where the documentation was smooth and complete and entirely untroubled, because that was usually where the problem was. Perfect paperwork in a complex industrial environment wasn't a sign that everything was fine. It was a sign that nobody was looking closely enough to find anything wrong. He found 3 sites that concerned him before the end of the first week. He brought his initial assessment to Naomi on a Friday afternoon. She read it while he sat across from her, which he'd come to understand was her preferred mode. She read in your presence rather than sending you away and reviewing it alone because she wanted to ask questions in real time and she didn't like the delay of email chains. She made notes in the margins. She asked 4 questions, all of them precise and based on specific details in the text. She didn't soften her response when one of his findings pointed at a structural decision she'd made herself 3 years ago. This one, the Marseille hub, she said, tapping the page. The ventilation configuration in the secondary processing area. That was a cost decision in the original build-out. I know, it's in the construction records. Cole leaned forward slightly. The configuration meets the regulatory minimum. It doesn't meet a reasonable interpretation of safe practice given what's being processed in that area. What's the exposure risk? Low-level VOC accumulation during high-volume processing shifts. Nobody's going to have an acute event, but workers on that floor full-time are getting chronic low-level exposure that the current monitoring doesn't capture because the monitoring points are positioned for audit compliance, not for actual worker air quality. He paused. It's the same principle as the pitcher. Meeting a standard isn't the same as being safe. She looked at the page for a moment. What does remediation look like? I want to get a team on site before I spec it fully. But preliminary estimate, additional ventilation units, repositioned monitoring, probably some physical workflow adjustment to reduce the duration workers spend in the highest exposure zones. We're not rebuilding the facility. Cost range? I'd rather give you a real number after the site visit. Ballpark. Significant but not catastrophic, he said. Less than a bad accident claim. Less than a regulatory fine if they decide to actually inspect that space. She set the report down. Schedule the site visit. I'll tell operations to expect you. I'd prefer to not announce it in advance. She looked at him. You want to show up unannounced at our Marseille facility. I want to see what the facility looks like when it's operating normally and not preparing for a visit. He held her gaze. If they know I'm coming, the monitoring logs will be reviewed, the workflow will be tidied up, the site supervisor will be on the floor instead of in the office. I'll see the performance, not the operation. A pause. All right, she said, unannounced. And then, with the briefest expression that might have been something like respect, who else is going with you? I'd like to hire 2 people first, a materials chemist and an industrial hygienist. I've had preliminary conversations with both. Former colleagues, they're good. Put them through HR, expedited process. She picked up the next page of the report. What are the other 2 sites? They went through the report together for another hour. He'd expected pushback. He'd built himself to receive pushback, to argue his findings on their merits and not capitulate if the argument wasn't actually sound. But Naomi didn't push back for the sake of it, and she didn't defend prior decisions when the evidence pointed another way. She was the same person in these conversations that she'd been every other time he'd been in this room with her. Direct, imperfect, occasionally too fast in her initial reaction, but willing to revise. What she wasn't, he was coming to understand, was consistent. Some days she was fully present, sharp, the version of herself he'd seen at that first Crane Street meeting when the toxicology results had landed and she'd immediately started making calls. Other days she came in carrying something, tiredness or pain, or the residual weight of the recovery, which was still ongoing, still non-linear, still punctuated by the bad days Dr. Ferris had promised. He'd seen her end a meeting early twice in the last month and come back 2 hours later without acknowledging the gap. He'd seen her be short with Marcus in a way that Marcus absorbed without comment. He'd heard her voice go slightly wrong, a controlled wobble in the middle of a conference call, and then steady itself and continue. He didn't mention any of it. It wasn't his place. She was functional and she was recovering and the rest of it was hers to manage. The Marseille site visit happened in March, 3 weeks after the Friday afternoon meeting. Cole flew with his newly hired materials chemist, a methodical man named Yusuf, who had spent 8 years doing environmental assessment at petrochemical facilities, and who had the specific quality that Cole valued most in this kind of work. He was comfortable being wrong. He didn't arrive at a site with a conclusion and look for evidence to support it. He arrived with questions and let the evidence build toward whatever it built toward. And if it built toward something that made the site look fine, he said that too. The Marseille hub was a significant operation, one of the company's European processing and redistribution centers, About 400 workers across 3 shifts. A large modern building that from the outside looked exactly like what it was. Clean, functional, well-maintained. The kind of facility that passed audits. Cole and Yusuf arrived on a Tuesday morning at 7:45, which was mid-shift for the early crew, and presented themselves at the security desk with their IDs and a one-line letter from the CEO's office that said the 2 individuals named were authorized to conduct a full-access operational safety review and that all staff were to cooperate fully and completely. The site manager, a stocky Frenchman named Laurent, who wore his authority the way people do when they've run the same operation for a long time and have developed strong feelings about the right way to do it, read the letter, and looked at Cole with an expression that Cole recognized immediately. It was the expression of a man who knew his operation was sound, who genuinely believed that, and who was also calculating how much disruption the next few hours were going to produce. "Nobody told me you were coming," Laurent said. "That was intentional," Cole said. A pause. "I run a clean operation here." "I'm sure you do," Cole said, without warmth but also without aggression. "I need access to every area, starting with the secondary processing floor." Laurent took them through himself, which Cole had expected. The site manager of a major hub wasn't going to let 2 people he'd never met wander his facility unescorted. He kept up a running commentary as they moved through the building, the professional monologue of a man showing his best work, pointing at the clean staging areas, the organized equipment bays, the updated safety signage. On the secondary processing floor, Cole stopped talking and started working. He had his own monitoring equipment, personal air sampling devices that he and Yusuf placed at worker height intervals across the floor, while Laurent watched with the expression of someone being tested and not entirely sure of the rules. He walked the ventilation pathway, tracing it from the intake through the distribution ducting to the exhaust. He noted the monitoring placements, exactly where he'd expected them to be, positioned to capture clean intake air rather than the recirculating air in the breathing zone of workers operating the processing equipment. "The monitoring positions," Cole said to Laurent, gesturing at the nearest sensor. "These are your air quality compliance points?" "Yes, they meet regulation. They're 3 meters above the work floor and positioned in the direct intake flow." Cole kept his voice neutral. "The workers aren't breathing intake air, they're breathing the recirculated air in their immediate work zone." Laurent looked at the sensor. Something moved in his face, a slight shift that Cole had seen before, in other sites, in other contexts. Not dishonesty. The more complicated thing, the beginning of the understanding that the story you've been telling yourself about your own operation might have a gap in it you hadn't seen. "The regulation specifies the measurement points," Laurent said. "Yes, it does," Cole agreed. "And your operation complies with the regulation. I'm not here about compliance." He looked at the sensor for a moment. "I'm here about whether your workers are safe." Yusuf was already noting the preliminary readings from the personal samplers. He caught Cole's eye and gave a small nod, the professional shorthand of 2 people who'd worked in the same field long enough to communicate efficiently. Not catastrophic, but not clean. They spent 6 hours in the facility. By the time they left, Cole had a full picture. The ventilation issue was real and measurable. The workers on the longest processing shifts were receiving consistent low-level exposure to VOC concentrations that sat in a range that wasn't acute but wasn't benign. And there were 2 additional concerns he hadn't identified from the documentation: a storage area where material compatibility was questionable, and a cleaning protocol in the equipment wash bay that was creating unnecessary chemical contact risk for the crew doing that work. Laurent walked them out. He was quieter than he'd been in the morning. He had the look of a man revising. At the door, he stopped. The ventilation. It was built this way from the start, 7 years. "I know," Cole said. "The workers have never—" He stopped. "There haven't been reported incidents." "Chronic low-level exposure doesn't usually produce reported incidents," Cole said. "It produces outcomes over time that don't get connected back to the exposure because nobody was measuring the right thing." He looked at Laurent directly. "I'm not here to assign blame for how it was built. I'm here because it needs to be fixed." Laurent was quiet for a moment. "How long do I have?" "I'll submit my formal report by end of week, but the storage compatibility issue, I want that addressed before the weekend. That one's more urgent." Laurent nodded, once, with the specific quality of a man who understood and didn't like it, but was going to do it anyway. Cole respected that. He'd encountered the other kind, the ones who nodded and then called their regional director to begin the process of pushing back. And Laurent wasn't that. He was a man who ran a clean operation and had just discovered that clean had a gap in it, and he was choosing to close the gap. Cole filed the report on Thursday. Naomi called him Friday morning. "I read it," she said. "Okay." "Laurent called me yesterday, before the report." Cole waited. "He wanted me to know," Naomi said, and her voice had something in it he hadn't heard before, that in 7 years of running that facility, he'd never had someone come in and explain his own operation to him. His words. He also said he wanted the ventilation work scheduled immediately, and he'd already pulled the storage protocol and had it revised by close of business. "That's good," Cole said. He said, a pause. He said he'd been uncomfortable with the ventilation layout since year 2, but every audit came back clean, so he told himself it was fine. Another pause. He said having someone come in and say out loud what he'd been thinking privately for 5 years was... She stopped. I'm paraphrasing. His English is better than his modesty about it. He said it was a relief. Cole sat with that for a moment. He thought about the way things accumulated when nobody said them out loud. The way a person could hold a private concern for 5 years and have it neutralized daily by clean paperwork until the concern and the paperwork occupied separate rooms in the mind and never quite confronted each other. Are there more sites like Marseille? Naomi asked. Probably, he said. I'd guess most of them are operating with some version of the same gap, different specifics, same structural issue, compliance documentation that measures the wrong things and gives everyone permission to stop looking. Then we have a lot of work ahead. Yes, he said. We do. March turned to April. The treatment continued. Naomi's blood arsenic levels came down to 14, which was within the reference range for the first time since the testing had begun. Dr. Ferris called it a significant milestone and used the word maintenance, which meant the intensive chelation phase was ending and the focus was shifting to supporting the nerve repair that was already underway. She stood for the first time in April, not unassisted. There was a parallel bar set up in the physical therapy room, and Dr. Vance was there, and Marcus was there, though he stood outside the door, and there was a quality of held breath in the room that Naomi would remember for the specific heaviness of it. She put her hands on the bars and pushed, and the legs, both of them, the left more confidently than the right, responded. Not fully, not without effort, not without the bar taking a significant portion of her weight, but she was upright. For the first time in 16 months, she was upright. She didn't say anything for a moment. Dr. Vance was watching her carefully, monitoring for the drop in blood pressure that sometimes accompanied sudden positional changes. Naomi stood at the bar and looked at the far wall of the room. White paint, a safety poster, a window with a view of the building's interior courtyard, and stayed there. How does that feel? Dr. Vance asked. Naomi took a breath. Like the first time, she said. Dr. Vance seemed to understand that she wasn't talking about physical sensation. She didn't stand for long. The effort was significant in ways she hadn't anticipated. Not pain, but an enormous muscular expenditure for something that had once required no thought at all. When she came back into the chair, her arms were shaking slightly and she felt a specific kind of tiredness that was different from the chronic exhaustion of the sick months. This was the tiredness of having done something. She was quiet in the car afterward. Marcus didn't fill the silence. He'd learned over 2 years exactly when silence was the correct response, and this was one of those times. When she got back to the building, she went to her office, sat at her desk, and called her mother in Phoenix. Mom, she said when the call connected, I need to tell you some things. She told her, all of it, not in the careful, curated version she'd been drafting for months, but the real sequence. The decline, the misdiagnosis, the picture, Cole, the results, the treatment. Her mother was quiet through most of it, and at the end there was a long pause that Naomi recognized as her mother deciding how to respond in the way that wouldn't make Naomi close off. You stood today, her mother said finally, at the parallel bars with support. But you stood. Yeah, I stood. Another pause. And this man, Cole, he works for me now, Director of Environmental Safety. A brief silence. Naomi? Mom. That's not what I was going to say. I know. A pause. He's a good person. He noticed something nobody else noticed, and he said it when it would have been easier not to. She looked at the empty corner of the desk. I'm trying to build a company that rewards that kind of thing, systematically, not just in one case. Her mother said something about wanting to visit. Naomi said she'd be welcome, and meant it in a way she hadn't meant something in a long time, without also calculating what it would cost her. Cole's first difficult moment in the role came in mid-April, and it came not from Naomi, but from the operations side of the company. He'd submitted a preliminary report on the Rotterdam terminal, the second facility he'd flagged from the initial documentation review. The report identified a significant concern. The Rotterdam terminal handled a class of freight that included industrial solvents, and the loading bay configuration meant that driver turnover time, when trucks arrived, were loaded, and departed, happened in an enclosed space with inadequate active ventilation. The exposure risk during peak volume periods was meaningful, and it was ongoing, multiple times daily. The operations director was a man named Gerald Marsh, no relation to board member Gordon, who had been with the company for 11 years and who ran the logistics operation with a tightness that Cole respected from a pure efficiency standpoint, but which had, Cole was finding, a shadow side. Gerald Marsh had metrics. He'd built the metrics carefully, and he ran against them with the focus of a person for whom the numbers were not just tools, but evidence of something about himself. And Cole's Rotterdam report threatened a specific metric: turnaround time in the loading bays. Increasing ventilation would require either structural modification or operational adjustment, opening bay doors during loading cycles, which would affect the weather-protected workflow that kept turnaround times low. Gerald requested a meeting. Cole attended. The meeting was in Gerald's office, which was on the 35th floor and decorated with the specific kind of performance data charts that told you something about the person who'd put them up. The Rotterdam report, Gerald said, without preamble. Yes. The ventilation recommendation would add approximately 11 minutes per cycle in the open door protocol during adverse weather conditions. He had a sheet in front of him with projections. Over a month of average operating volume, that's a meaningful hit to throughput. I understand that, Cole said, and the alternative, structural ventilation enhancement, is a significant capital expenditure. I know. So I want to understand your confidence level in the risk assessment. He said it neutrally, but Cole knew what was being asked underneath it. The solvent concentrations in the enclosed bay during peak cycles are above the NIOSH recommended exposure limits, Cole said, not above the regulatory action threshold because the regulatory threshold for that class of solvent is higher than the NIOSH recommendation, but higher than what I'd consider acceptable. He paused. The drivers are in that space for 15 to 20 minutes per visit, multiple visits per day for the regulars. This isn't speculative. I've got personal sampler data from an observation period. Gerald looked at the projections. If we implement the open door protocol during high volume periods only, then workers during low volume periods stay exposed. Cole kept his voice even. The exposure risk doesn't go away because the volume is lower. A pause. I'm not trying to make your operation harder, Cole said. I'm telling you what the data shows. If the data showed it was fine, I'd tell you that. He looked at Gerald steadily. I'd rather have this conversation with you than have it later, after something happens. Gerald looked at the sheet for a moment. Then he looked up. If I push back through the chain, what happens? Cole had thought about this. Then it goes to Naomi, he said, and I'm confident she'll read the data the same way I did. He paused. But I'd rather not put it in front of her as a conflict between your function and mine. I'd rather we figure out a workable solution before it gets there. Another pause, longer. Gerald was running something through. Cole could see it, the calculation of a man who knew his metrics, and also somewhere underneath the metrics, knew what the right answer was. What's the minimum implementation that addresses the risk? Gerald said finally. I'll work with Yusuf on a specific spec, Cole said. I want to give you something workable, not just a principle. He paused. Give me a week. Gerald nodded. Not warmly. They were not going to be warm with each other, Cole sensed, at least not for a while. But the nod was real. Cole walked back to the elevator and pressed 38. The building moved around him, its usual daytime rhythm. Voices from conference rooms, the hum of servers from the IT floor as he passed it, the smell of coffee from the break area. An ordinary building, full of ordinary activity, carrying inside it the thousand small decisions that would determine over time whether the people inside it were safe. He got off at 38, went to his office, stood for a moment in front of the facility map. Marseille, Rotterdam, 3 other sites he hadn't gotten to yet. A company of 4,000 people across 3 continents. The job was bigger than the first 3 months had made it feel, because the first 3 months had been orientation, reading, site visits, building the function from language on paper into something with actual people and actual authority. The real work was starting now. He sat down, pulled up Yusuf's preliminary Rotterdam data, and got to work. That evening, he called Mrs. Alvarez to check in. She'd had a knee procedure in March and was still recovering, and Cole had been covering her grocery runs and checking in twice a week. She asked about the new job in the way she asked about everything, directly, without ceremony, expecting a real answer. "It's harder than I expected," he said, in a good way. Good hard or just hard? He thought about Laurent's face in the Marseille facility, about Gerald's pause before the nod, about Naomi standing at the parallel bar, which she'd told him about in passing, the way she told him things, matter of fact, without asking for a response, just putting it out into the space between them. Both, he said, mostly good. Mrs. Alvarez said that sounded right to her and asked about Iris's ocean project, which had apparently reached a presentation phase that Iris had mentioned in some detail during their last evening together. Cole told her about the poster Iris had made, hand-drawn, 3 feet wide, featuring a penguin labeled with anatomical details in 6-year-old handwriting. And Mrs. Alvarez laughed, and Cole laughed too, and outside the kitchen window the April evening was doing what April evenings did, going cool and clear, and very slightly promising. The Rotterdam solution took 11 days, not 7. Cole had told Gerald a week, and then the data from Yusuf's second observation period came back with a variable he hadn't fully accounted for. The solvent concentration spiked more dramatically during the morning rush window than the afternoon cycles, which changed the calculus on the minimum viable intervention. He spent 2 days revising, brought Yusuf in for a 4-hour working session, and came out the other end with something that was more specific and more defensible than the first version, even if it meant going back to Gerald and explaining the delay. Gerald took the delay without comment. He read the revised spec, asked 3 questions, and on the 3rd day of the following week signed off on a phased implementation plan. Structural ventilation enhancement in the primary loading bay, operational protocol changes for the secondary bays during high-volume morning windows, and a monitoring schedule that would track actual worker zone air quality rather than the compliance measurement points that had been passing audits for years. The implementation would take 4 months. It would cost money. It would affect, marginally but measurably, some of Gerald's turnaround metrics during the construction phase. Gerald had submitted the budget request himself, without Cole prompting him, which Cole noted quietly and without ceremony, the way you note things that matter without making a production of them. He told Naomi in a Friday afternoon check-in. She listened, asked 1 question about the monitoring schedule, and then said, "Good. What's next on the site list?" "Singapore," he said. "I want to go in May." "Coordinate with operations, and take someone local if you can, someone who knows the regulatory environment there." "I was thinking about that. Yusuf has a contact at an environmental consultancy in Singapore who does industrial hygiene work. I want to meet her before we go in." "Set it up." A pause. "How's Yusuf working out?" "He's good. Different style than mine. More methodical, slower to the conclusion. But the conclusions are solid." "That's not a bad compliment," Naomi said. "No," Cole agreed. "It's not." She was looking at something on her desk while they talked, not distracted, just the way she operated during conversations that didn't require her full visual attention. Then she set it down and looked at him directly. "I'm walking with a cane," she said. He hadn't known. He hadn't seen her in person in 10 days. She'd been traveling, a board commitment in London that she'd finally felt able to attend in person. He'd spoken to her twice by phone during the trip, both times about operational matters, and she hadn't mentioned it. "Since when?" he said. "I took the first steps in the hotel corridor in London. 3 days ago." She said it the way she said most things about her recovery, factual, without performance. 12 steps before I needed the chair again. But 12 steps. Cole looked at her. That's real. Yes. She looked at the window, the city below, the particular afternoon light of late April coming off the glass of the buildings opposite. Dr. Ferris says the right side is about 6 weeks behind the left. He thinks full assisted walking by June or July. After that, she paused. He won't predict after that, which I've learned to respect. 6 weeks ago, he wouldn't predict June, Cole said. No, he wouldn't. A pause. I'm aware of the direction of travel. They sat with that for a moment. It wasn't a silence that needed filling. My mother visited last week, Naomi said, before London. How was that? Hard. Good. She turned the pen in her hand. A habit, he'd noticed, something she did when she was processing rather than performing. She cried, which she never does, so it was a lot. She kept saying she wished I'd told her earlier, and I kept not knowing how to explain why I hadn't. She stopped. She stayed 4 days. We watched 3 movies, which is more movies than I've watched in 2 years. She made soup in my kitchen, which I've had professionally equipped for years and barely use. She met Marcus and approved of him, which I think meant more to him than he let on. Cole smiled. Did she ask about me? She asked about the man who noticed the picture. Naomi looked at him with a slight dry expression. I told her you were now director of environmental safety and that you had a daughter named Iris who liked penguins. She said that was the most interesting sentence she'd heard in several years. It's an accurate sentence. It is. The dry expression softened just slightly. She wants to meet you at some point. She said to tell you, this is a direct quote, that she intends to thank you properly. Cole shifted in his chair. Tell her I don't need thanking. I told her you'd say that. She said that was the other thing she wanted to meet you about. He laughed, a real one, the kind that comes out without consulting you first. Naomi's expression in response was the one she got sometimes that was almost a smile, but lived just adjacent to it, restrained by some long-practiced habit that he suspected was older than her professional life. May arrived, and with it the Singapore visit, and a shift in the company that was becoming visible in ways Cole hadn't entirely anticipated. Word had moved through the organization, not officially, not through any announcement or memo, but in the way things move through organizations when enough people know pieces of the story. The cleaning crew janitor who'd saved the CEO's life, the picture, the toxicology results. The new director of environmental safety who showed up unannounced at your facility and measured your air quality at worker height instead of the ceiling. The response was not uniform. There were people, like Laurent in Marseille, who took it as permission to say things they'd been sitting on, small concerns, workflow observations, material questions that had felt too minor to escalate and now had a department to go to. Cole started receiving emails from site supervisors, floor managers, a facilities coordinator in the Sao Paulo hub who had been documenting a drainage issue for 2 years without getting anyone at the corporate level to take it seriously. He read them all. He responded to all of them, which he gathered was notable enough that Marcus mentioned it once in passing. You know, most people at the director level don't personally respond to facility-level emails, Marcus said, not as a criticism. I know, Cole said. The facility-level emails are the job. There were also people who were less comfortable with what the function represented. A regional operations manager in the Amsterdam office sent a message to Gerald, which Gerald forwarded to Cole without comment, which Cole appreciated, expressing concern that the new safety function was creating a culture of second-guessing that would undermine operational confidence. It was not a stupid concern, framed a certain way. Cole wrote a response, revised it twice to remove the parts that were technically correct but unnecessarily sharp, and sent it to the Amsterdam manager directly. He explained the function's scope and its limits and the distinction between second-guessing and independent assessment. He did not hear back, but 2 weeks later the Amsterdam manager requested a site consultation on a ventilation concern he'd had in his processing area, which Cole took as the more meaningful response. The Singapore assessment was the most complex site visit yet. A large distribution and processing facility with a multi-tier workforce, a regulatory environment that differed from the European sites in specific ways that required the local contact Yusuf had identified, and a materials profile that included several chemical classes Cole hadn't seen in depth since his industrial days. He and Yusuf and the Singapore consultant, a sharp, compact woman named Dr. Lin, who had 20 years of field experience and a polite ferocity in her assessments that Cole found immediately trustworthy, spent 4 days in the facility and came out with a report that was longer and more complicated than any of the previous ones. He filed it on a Friday and went home to find Iris had constructed an elaborate diagram of the Singapore Strait on a piece of poster board, which she was in the process of populating with marine fauna, using a combination of encyclopedic knowledge and artistic freedom that produced penguins of varying anatomical accuracy. "Penguins don't live in Singapore," he said. "These ones are visiting," she said without looking up. He stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her add a penguin to the diagram, with the focused solemnity of an artist defending a creative choice, and felt the specific texture of that moment, the poster board, and the colored markers, and the September light through the kitchen window, and the particular reality of being in this apartment with this 6-year-old who was almost 7, and the way the last 8 months had moved, and where he was now standing versus where he'd been. He made dinner. They ate. She told him about a disagreement she'd had at school about whether sharks were mean or just hungry, and he said that was actually a complicated philosophical question, and she said no, it wasn't. Sharks were just hungry, and he said she was probably right. After she was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and finished a section of the Singapore report he'd left incomplete. Around 11, he made tea, which he almost never did, and sat with it, and didn't work and didn't think about work either. Just sat with the quiet of the apartment and the sleeping city outside. He thought about a thing Naomi had said to him once, in passing, during a late office conversation that had moved between the Frankfurt hub and other things in the way their conversations sometimes did. She'd said she used to believe that the way you knew you were doing the right work was that it was hard, that difficulty was the signal. He'd thought about it since, not because he agreed entirely, but because he didn't entirely disagree. And the part he disagreed with was interesting. The difficulty wasn't the signal. The difficulty was just what the right work usually felt like, because the right work was rarely the convenient work. And that was not the same as saying difficulty was evidence of rightness. Plenty of wrong things were hard. What he'd come to think, sitting with the Singapore report and the tea and the quiet, was that the signal was something simpler. The signal was whether, at the end of a hard day, you could look at what you'd done and say, that was real. Not perfect, not smooth, not finished, but real and pointed in the right direction. He could say that tonight. He went to bed. In June, Naomi walked across her office without the cane. Not far, 7 steps from the physical therapy setup that Dr. Vance had installed in the corner of the room to the desk. Dr. Vance was there, one hand slightly raised and not quite touching her, ready. Naomi had insisted on doing it in the office and not the therapy facility, which Dr. Vance had resisted and then conceded because Naomi made a specific kind of case for things that was difficult to argue against without veering into paternalism. She walked the 7 steps. She got to the desk and put both hands on its surface and stood there breathing. And Dr. Vance said nothing. And the city was outside the windows doing what it always did. And the empty corner of the desk that had once held the picture was on her left, in her peripheral vision. She walked back, 11 steps this time. She miscounted the distance and had to go further than she'd planned. She sat back into the chair and Dr. Vance handed her water and checked her pulse and blood pressure and said something clinical and satisfied, and Naomi sat and looked at the window. Marcus appeared in the doorway a few minutes later. He'd been outside. She'd made him wait outside, because there were certain things that required a specific privacy even from the people you trusted most. He looked at her and looked at Dr. Vance, and Dr. Vance gave him the smallest nod. Marcus looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at Naomi. "The Frankfurt call is in 20 minutes, he said. "I know," she said. "Do you want 5 minutes?" "I'm fine," she said. And then, because it was true and because Marcus deserved the real answer, "I'm better than fine." He nodded again, slower this time, the other kind of nod, and went to set up the call. She sat at the desk. The Frankfurt call, the quarterly review, the Singapore report sitting in her inbox that she'd been meaning to read in full since Cole had filed it, the Amsterdam situation, the Rotterdam construction timeline, the board's questions about the function's expansion into the Asia-Pacific facilities. The work was what it always was, large, ongoing, unfinished, demanding the full version of herself that she was, for the first time in almost 2 years, approaching the possibility of being again. She pulled up the Singapore report. She read the executive summary. She read the findings section. She read Cole's recommendations, which were specific and sequenced and priced, because he'd learned early that recommendations without price tags were wishes, not plans. She got to the final paragraph of the report, which she noticed was different in character from his previous reports. Less strictly technical, more willing to say something direct. He'd written, "The pattern across all sites reviewed to date is consistent. Compliance documentation meets regulatory standards. Actual worker exposure conditions frequently exceed what those standards were designed to protect against, because the standards measure the wrong things or the right things in the wrong places. This is not primarily a failure of intent. Site managers are not, in the main, indifferent to worker safety. It is a failure of attention. Organizations develop processes that tell them they are paying attention when they are actually just documenting that they check the boxes. The solution is not more documentation. It is the replacement of documentation as substitute for observation with actual observation, routinely, by people with the training and authority to say what they see. That is what this function exists to do. We are at the beginning of doing it." She read that paragraph twice. Then she picked up her phone and called him. "I'm reading the Singapore report," she said when he picked up. "Okay." "The last paragraph." A brief pause. "I went back and forth on including it." "I know, I can tell." She looked at the window. "Leave it in. The board needs to read that paragraph." "You think they'll receive it well?" "Theo Adair won't," she said. "Gordon Marsh will. Patricia Venny will ask 3 questions about implementation, which means she agrees with it and wants to make sure she understands it before she says so." She paused. "I think it needs to be said in those terms. We've spent 20 years in this industry building the assumption that paperwork equals safety. That's not going to change quietly." "No," Cole said. "It's not." "How's the Singapore follow-up timeline?" "Dr. Lin is handling the immediate items on site. The larger structural work, I want to go back in September with a full team. The facility is complex enough that Yusuf and I alone weren't sufficient. Budget it and submit it. Already drafted." She almost smiled. "Of course it is." A pause. "Cole?" "Yeah." "I walked across the office today, without the cane." The silence on the line was the kind that meant he'd heard it and was sitting with it before responding, which she'd come to understand was just how he processed things that mattered. He didn't rush to fill the space. "How far?" he said. 7 steps, then 11 on the way back." "That's not 7 steps," he said. "That's 18 steps." This time she did smile. "Dr. Ferris says full independent ambulation," his phrase, "is possible by late summer or fall. He still won't commit to a timeline. He says every nervous system writes its own schedule." "That sounds right to me," Cole said. "It does to me too." She looked at the empty corner of the desk. She'd been thinking about putting something there. Not as a replacement. You don't replace a thing like that with another thing. Just as an acknowledgement that the space existed and could hold something that wasn't harmful. She hadn't decided what yet. "My mother called this morning. She wants to come back in August. She's asking me to take actual time off while she's here." "Are you going to?" "I told her I'd think about it." "Which means no." "Which means I'm thinking about it." A pause. "Maybe a few days." "A few days," he said, with a tone that was not quite dry but lived in the same neighborhood. "Don't push it." "I'm not pushing anything," he said, and she could hear that he was smiling, which was a thing she'd learned to hear in his voice over the last several months. It didn't come out loudly or often, but when it was there, it was genuine, which made it worth more than the performed kind. She ended the call and took the Frankfurt call and managed the quarterly review and worked until 7. And then she did something she'd been doing more often lately. She went home at a human hour. The moment that settled something, not resolved it, settled it, which is different, which means it found a place to rest without needing to be solved, came in July, on a Tuesday evening, in a context so ordinary that it would have been easy to miss. Cole had brought Iris to the office. It wasn't planned as a significant event. He'd had a late meeting that ran long. Iris's school had an early dismissal, Mrs. Alvarez was at a follow-up appointment for her knee, and the logistics had simply produced a situation where Iris came to the building with him at 4:30 and sat in his office with a library book and a bag of crackers while he finished the meeting. Naomi passed the open door of his office on her way to the elevator at 5:15 and stopped. Iris looked up from the book. She had the directness of a child who had not yet learned the adult habit of pretending not to notice people. "You're in a wheelchair," Iris said. "Iris?" Cole said, from behind his desk. "That's all right," Naomi said. She looked at Iris with the expression of someone encountering a genuinely interesting phenomenon. "I am, yes. Some of the time. Less than I used to." "Do you like it?" "No," Naomi said without hesitation. "But it's been useful." Iris considered this with apparent seriousness. "My friend Maya has one. She says people look at her differently when she's in it." "They do," Naomi said. "You get used to it. Or you learn to use it anyway." "Use it how?" Naomi looked at the 6-year-old across the small office space, the cracker bag and the library book and the focused attention. "You learn to tell the difference between people who see the chair and people who see you," she said. "It's useful information." Iris thought about that. "My dad sees people," she said, in the tone of a person reporting a fact. Something moved in Naomi's face, not a large movement. "Yes," she said. "He does." She looked at Cole across the room, and he met her eyes, and the look between them was not dramatic. It didn't need to be. It would have been wrong if it had been. It was just clear. The look of two people who had come through something and were standing on the other side of it, imperfectly, still mid-process, still figuring out the shapes of their own lives, but standing. "What are you reading?" Naomi asked Iris. "It's about the deep ocean," Iris said, holding it up. "The part where the light doesn't go." "What's down there?" "Lots of things," Iris said with enthusiasm. "Things that make their own light. Things that nobody's seen yet. The book says most of the ocean is still unexplored." She considered this. "I think that's good. It means there's still stuff to find." Naomi held her gaze for a moment. "I think that's right," she said. She said goodbye to Iris, who said bye back with the easy unself-consciousness of a child who has not yet learned to make departures complicated. Naomi looked at Cole once more, brief, sufficient, and continued to the elevator. Cole sat at his desk for a moment after she'd gone. Iris had already returned to the book. "She's nice," Iris said, without looking up. "Yeah," Cole said. "She is." She didn't look at me weird for asking about the wheelchair. No, she wouldn't. Iris turned a page. "Dad?" "Yeah." "Is this your real job now? The one you actually do?" He looked around the office. The whiteboard, the facility map, the framed authority clause, the Singapore report draft on his screen, the stack of materials from the Rotterdam construction update, the email from the Sao Paulo coordinator that he'd responded to that morning about the drainage issue, which had turned out to be more significant than even the coordinator had suspected and was now on the active remediation list. "Yeah," he said. "This is it." "Good," she said. "You seem like you're actually doing something." He looked at her for a moment. This person who was almost 7 and had penguin socks and a bicuspid aortic valve that was being monitored, and a mother who'd left, and a father who cleaned offices for 3 years and noticed things, and thought that she was right in the specific way she was usually right, plainly and without ceremony. "I am," he said. The Reinhold matter resolved in September. Cole wasn't directly involved. It was a legal and regulatory process that Naomi's team managed, and she kept him informed in broad strokes without pulling him into the detail, because it wasn't his function. The medical board investigation found sufficient grounds for a formal review of Reinhold's prescribing practices and his recommendation of unlicensed wellness products to patients with active diagnoses. His practice license was suspended pending the full investigation. The 2 other patients who'd been identified, the one with elevated arsenic levels had undergone successful treatment. The one who'd tested clear had been monitored and remained clear, were cooperating with the review. Naomi told Cole in a brief phone call. She was matter-of-fact about it, the way she was matter-of-fact about most things once they were resolved. She didn't editorialize. "Is that the end of it for you?" Cole asked. A pause. "Not entirely," she said. I don't think these things have clean endings, but it's the end of the active part. She was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about whether to feel, I don't know the right word. Vindicated doesn't fit. Satisfied doesn't fit. What fits? She thought about it. Finished, she said finally. Not with the recovery, that's still going, but with that specific chapter. It's done, and I'm here. And that's enough. He understood what she meant. Not as resignation, as the specific kind of clarity that comes when you stop waiting for the right moment to acknowledge that you made it through something, and you just acknowledge it. Are you walking today? He asked. I walked to the elevator this morning without the cane. A pause. And back. That's not nothing. No, she said. It's not. Checked. The company's annual safety review in October was the first one that Cole's function had a formal role in, not just a report submitted through another department, but a presentation to the board, 45 minutes, with follow-up discussion. He prepared for it the way he prepared for site visits, by trying to see it clearly instead of the way he wanted it to look. He wrote the presentation 3 times. The first version was too technical, the kind of thing that made sense to people who already understood the field and communicated nothing to people who didn't. The second version was too polished, the kind of thing that answered every question before it was asked, and thereby prevented the board from having to actually think about anything. The third version was what he gave. He stood at the front of the boardroom, stood behind the podium, which he'd requested rather than presenting from a chair, because he wanted to be standing for this, a choice he didn't examine too closely, but that felt right in a way he trusted. And he said plainly what the first 8 months of the function had found, and what it meant, and what would happen if the work continued, and what would happen if it didn't. He showed the data from Marseille and Rotterdam and Singapore. He showed the before and after air quality readings. He showed the materials compatibility issue from Singapore resolved against the potential cost of an acute incident at the same facility. He showed the email queue from site-level staff across 4 continents who had started using the function as a resource, which he presented not as a metric of his own success, but as evidence that the people closest to the work had things to say that the audit system wasn't designed to hear. He said, the compliance model tells organizations that they are safe when they have passed a test. The assessment model tells organizations what is actually happening in their facilities. These are not the same thing, and the difference between them over time is the difference between a record that is clean and a workforce that is. He said, the cases we've addressed in the first 8 months were not aberrations. They were normal operations that had been operating without the right observation. There are more of them. We will find more of them. That is the job. He said, employee safety before profit margin is not a value statement. It is an operational principle, and it requires decision-making authority at the point of risk, not a request submitted up a chain that has financial interests at every link. Gordon Marsh asked one question at the end. If you had to name the single most important thing this function does, what would you say? Cole thought about the smell from the pitcher, about Laurent's face in Marseille, about the Sao Paulo drainage issue and the Amsterdam ventilation concern and the Rotterdam morning window and 100 small things that the paperwork had called fine and the observation had called wrong. We look, he said. That's it. We look at what's actually there instead of what the documentation says is there. Everything else follows from that. Patricia Venny asked 3 questions. Theo Adair asked 2, both sharper than his earlier ones, which Cole took as a sign of genuine engagement. The board authorized the Asia-Pacific expansion of the function and a 15% budget increase for the following year. Naomi didn't say anything to him afterward in the room. The board members engaged her, and then there was the debrief with Marcus and the operations leads. But she caught his eye once across the room in the moment after Gordon Marsh's question, when Cole had given his answer. Just a look. One of those looks that carries a whole conversation's worth of content in the space of 2 seconds. He met it. He went back to his office. He sat at his desk. He looked at the facility map and the whiteboard and the framed contract clause. And he looked at the city outside the window. October, the light changing, the particular amber quality of a city in the shift between seasons. He thought about the drive to the building that first night, 8 months ago in a lifetime. The parking lot, the cart, the way a room looks when you're cleaning it versus the way it looks when it's yours. He thought about the smell that had stopped him, that particular combination that 7 years of paying attention had made recognizable, and the 2 minutes he'd stood outside the door working up the nerve, and the way the door had opened. He thought about what it had cost, and what it had changed, and what was still changing, which was most of it. The recovery wasn't finished. The function wasn't finished. Iris was still being monitored, and Mrs. Alvarez's knee was still a monthly appointment, and the Civic had a new taillight, but was going to need brake work in the spring, and life was still the thing it always was. Ongoing, imperfect, expensive in the ways that matter, and occasionally generous in ways you didn't plan for. He thought about what Iris had said about the deep ocean, things that make their own light, things nobody's seen yet, most of it still unexplored. The idea that the unknown wasn't a deficit but an abundance, that there was still more to find than had been found, and that this was good news rather than a source of dread. He thought you could apply that to a person. Most of a person is unexplored. Most of a life is still ahead of its own understanding. The part that's visible, the resume, the title, the parking space, or absence of one, the way you appear to people who look quickly, is the surface. Under the surface, there's whatever actually is there. The things you noticed when nobody was watching, the choices you made when the easier choice was available, the moment you stood outside a door and went through it anyway. Those things don't announce themselves. They don't appear on a CV or get framed on a wall. They're just what you did, in the time you had, with what you could see. Cole had spent 3 years being unseen in rooms. He'd learned in those years that being unseen is not the same as being absent. You can be fully present in a room where nobody's looking at you. You can notice everything and carry what you notice carefully and know what to do with it when the moment comes. The moment had come. He'd done what you do. The rest of it, the function, the map, the facilities on 4 continents that were slowly becoming, site by site and person by person, more honest about what they actually were, was what followed from a single decision made on an ordinary night, in an office that wasn't his, by a man who smelled something wrong and decided it was worth saying out loud. That was the whole story, in the end. Not the job, not the salary, not the recovery or the legal resolution or the board presentation. The whole story was, he'd noticed and he hadn't looked away, and he'd said what he saw. It was not a complicated story. The things that change lives rarely are. The difficulty is never in the understanding. Most people looking at it clearly understand exactly what the right thing is. The difficulty is in the doing, in the moment between knowing and acting, when the easier choice is still available and the cost of the other one is still real, and you have to decide in that gap who you actually are. Cole had decided. Naomi had decided. Iris was going to decide in her own time about her own things, the ocean and its unexplored depths, and whatever she found there that nobody had found yet. Outside the window, the city was exactly what it always was, present, unfinished, lit. He picked up his phone and called Mrs. Alvarez about the grocery list, and she answered on the second ring, and they talked about what she needed and whether her knee was better, and whether he thought Iris would eat lentil soup, which Iris had recently decided was suspicious. And outside, the October light was doing the slow, unhurried work of becoming evening. It was an ordinary phone call. It was the kind of phone call a life is mostly made of, in between the moments that get remembered. He made it carefully, the way he made most things. Not perfectly, not smoothly, but with attention. That was enough. That had always been enough.